I was around 14 or 15 when this happened, and I'm female for anyone who wants to know. There was a park where I used to go to whenever I'd have a row with my parents, which was quite often around those times. This meant I would turn up there in the middle of the day, middle of the night. There was no real pattern to it, and nothing really weird had ever happened before this night. I tended to sit on a bench which was right at the back of the park, right by a wooded area, as I didn't want anyone to see me crying. Of course, I realize how stupid this was now, but back then I was young and really unhappy. It must have been about 9 or half past at this point, and it was just starting to get dark since it was summertime. This guy came over and sat down next to me. Now I know what you're thinking. That would not normally be that weird, but this guy had just come straight out of the woods rather than from the direction of the park. The other odd thing I noticed was that he was wearing a t-shirt, shorts, and these black gloves. He must have been around 40 years old, I think. I'm not sure though. I've always been rubbish at reading ages. He was 6'5", quite stocky and a bit fat as well. The man immediately asked me what was wrong, which embarrassed me quite a bit. I can't even remember what I said in response, but it was probably fairly hostile. I didn't want anyone to see me like that after all. He then commented that I was really tall for a girl. I was about 6'2" back then. He then kinda laughed creepily in my ear and whispered, "I'm bigger though." I always tend to listen to my instincts, and this guy was reading about a 7 out of 10 on the freakometer. I decided it would probably be best to just leave. As I went to stand though, he reached out, as though to grab my arm or something. He smiled at me once more, but it was one of those smiles that don't reach your eyes, so they just look wrong. The man asked me to sit back down, and demanded I tell him what was wrong. Instead, I told him my dad was waiting for me, and I had to leave right now. He then said he knew my dad was not waiting for me. He'd watched me walk into the park from the main road by myself, and liars would be punished. At that point, I just turned around and ran. Back in those days, I was fairly quick. Instead of running in a straight line, I weaved through the playground equipment, figuring it would be harder for such a big guy to get through those tight spaces. I got to the other side of the park and turned around to see if the man was still nearby. He was standing over by the slide, just kind of watching me. I also noticed at this point there was another guy standing right at the edge of the wooded bit. He would have basically been right behind me while I was sitting down on the bench. Neither one of them attempted to chase me at this point, and I ran out onto the path that led to the main road. There was a van parked in the car park, but at that point I didn't connect it with them. When I got out to the main road, it was fairly busy for that time of night, and I finally stopped running. I decided even with everything going on, it was best to go home at this point. About halfway there though, I saw the van from the car park on the road right behind me. It never attempted to overtake anyone. It just kind of continued on the same route as me. I turned off down a road that was near my street, but not actually on it. After a couple of minutes, the van turned down as well and parked just at the top of the road. No one got out, but I could see what I thought were 2 people inside. At that point, I was extremely afraid to head home, as I thought they'd find out where I lived. My parents often left me on my own as well, as they were neglectful douchebags. I knocked on the first door I saw, and thankfully a kind old lady answered. She took me inside and helped me call the police. By the time someone came though, the van was long gone. They never did catch either of those guys from the park, though I'm not sure how hard they looked, as they hadn't specifically done anything. I hadn't thought to take a note of the van license plate either, because I hadn't associated it with them at first. To this day, I still have no real idea what they had planned, or if they were just trying to freak me out or what, but the gloves and the van make me think it could have ended very badly for me. To give you a little bit of backstory, I live in a small town called Belton in Texas. I'm an 18-year-old guy, and I weigh about 195 pounds. I'm 5'6" and somewhat athletic. I played football in high school and know a little bit of martial arts as well as some boxing, so I know how to take a hit. I always carry a pocket knife on me for work as well, and just in case anything were to happen where I would need it. Anyway, this all happened a couple of weeks ago, after I'd just gotten off work from McDonald's. It was around 12 a.m. or so. I had to walk home because my mom was out that night with some friends having fun. Now, my house was about an hour away walking distance, and halfway through there was this park. I stopped at the park along the way. I was fairly tired from work and I was hungry as well. After work, I usually like to take something with me to eat on the way back. I sat down at one of the park benches and started to eat my food when I noticed 3 kids playing alone at the park, all of them boys. At the time, I remember thinking to myself, man, shouldn't these kids be at home sleeping or something? I brushed it off then. Those kids were allowed to do whatever they wanted. I continued to eat my food and mind my own business. After all, I did used to sneak out of my house with my friends when I was younger too. I started to get on my phone and was just about to start listening to some music when I noticed that I could no longer hear those kids playing in the background. I looked around and noticed that now a man was talking to them. At first, I thought it must have been one of the boys' fathers, perhaps worried about them and picking them up. As I looked a bit closer, though, I noticed the man who was illuminated by the street lights. I saw he looked kind of dirty and greasy. Focusing a bit more, I could hear the man now offering the kids candy and such if they'd follow him over to his car. At this point, I knew I couldn't let this go on any longer. I walked over to those boys, and I asked the man what he was doing. Why was he trying to trick these little kids like this? He played dumb, but I surely was not buying this. Now I was face to face with this guy. He was much older looking than I thought he was. Maybe in his early 40s even. He was 6 feet tall and even a little more muscular than I was. He had a scraggly looking beard and a couple of missing teeth as well. Again, though, I stood my ground and demanded to know what he was doing. He told me it was none of my business, to which I replied it was if he was going to mess with these children. The guy inched his way towards me, clearly trying to pick a fight. I pulled out my pocket knife and told him not to even think about it. I told him he had 5 seconds to get out of here or I would shiv his stomach till I was bored. I'm not a violent person, and I didn't really want to risk a fight with this guy, but I knew I couldn't back down at this point. I started counting down. 5, 4, 3, inching my way closer to him with each count. The guy clearly was freaked out. He turned around and ran to his car, which was parked a few yards away from where we were. I gave chase, just to make sure he actually left. I kicked the side of the man's car until he pulled off and hauled ass away. I did try to get his license plate number to report it as well to the cops, but there was not one visible, at least not one that I could see on the back of his car. I offered to walk those kids home. It was a little ways off from my house, but I was willing to make a side trip to make sure that guy didn't come back. It turns out 2 of the boys were brothers. I dropped them off at their house and told their mother what had happened. She thanked me, and I told her to call the cops right away when she got the chance. I then took the other kid home. He lived in somewhat of a more sketchy neighborhood. Anyways, I get the feeling we were being followed, and I was right. That same man was either by pure coincidence or through vigorous stalking, now following us in his car. He wasn't directly behind us. He was sort of a few yards away, quietly slinking behind. I took the boy to his house, but like a dumbass, I forgot the man could just try and attack us. He sprinted out of his car and knocked me over to the ground. He was clearly going for this kid, trying to grab him and run away. I grabbed the man's ankle and made him trip, and screamed at the kid to run for his house. Me and the man fought it out. He was much stronger than I had expected. He pushed me to the ground again and pinned me. He tried to reach into my pocket and grab my pocket knife. I fought like hell trying to get him off me, but he was too heavy. Luckily, the kid had managed to get some help. Just as if on cue, the cops pulled the man off of me, then put him in the cop car. One of the officers asked me some questions and asked if I was all right. I also accepted a ride home. I was extremely tired after everything that happened. and I didn't feel like walking all that extra way. The kid's mom, I assume, called the cops. She thanked me and asked if I was alright too. I told her I was fine. I was thankful that she'd call the cops. I told my mom the story the next day about what happened. She was just thankful I was alright. I found out later the man was sent to prison. I thought to myself, good, he deserves to rot for that kind of thing. Apparently, this was not his first crime, nor his first act of attempted child molestation. When I was younger, I lived in the suburbs of Chicago with my parents and my little sister at my grandparents' house. We used to be a very close family, always getting together for birthdays, Thanksgiving, Christmas, etc. That was until they all became money hungry and held grudges against family members who couldn't get the money back to them right away. My story takes place on March 28, 2000. My family and some family friends gathered to my grandparents' house for my dad's 30th birthday. It was a surprise birthday party. I sometimes really hated when we had family gatherings because everyone would always ask to see how my front teeth were growing in. I don't remember exactly why, but when I was young, I had to get my 4 top teeth pulled out when I was real little. Everyone always made fun of me about how cute it was, because I'd always sing "All I Want for Christmas is my 4 front teeth." A couple of hours into the party, my sister and my cousins and I started to get really bored. We couldn't play my Nintendo because everyone was in the basement drinking, playing games, and watching whatever football or whatever was on at the time. We asked our parents if we could go to the park right down the street together. The best part of the park was about a 4-minute walk away. They were a bit hesitant at first since it was already quite dark out, but they said we could go for just an hour, as long as my cousin Steven, who was 12 at the time, would watch us and make sure nothing bad happened. We walked over to the park extremely excited. We started off by playing on the swings together, competing to see who could swing the highest. My cousin Steven had a bit of a late start, because he had to push my little sister to get her going. Very quickly, though, we got bored of that game. We decided to play what every awesome kid plays every now and then, lava. We mixed it up a bit and added Shark Attack in there as well. Just a bit after we'd started playing, though, a guy that looked to be about my dad's age strolled into the park on a bicycle. He started to talk to us, but my big, brave cousin told him we weren't allowed to talk to random strangers. The man tried to tell us he had just been with my cousin's parents, and he'd only come by to check up on us and hang around to make sure nothing bad happened. I didn't remember seeing this guy at the party, but I listened to him anyway. I don't really know what we were all thinking. I guess there were a bit too many people there. I figured he really could have come to the party a little bit after we left or something. The man asked what we were playing. When we said Lava and Shark Attack, he gave a weird little smile and said, "My favorite games." The guy wanted to join us. He wanted to be the shark. He grabbed my sister, my cousin Michelle and I, and pick us up and spin us around. Of course, we didn't really think anything of it. We thought this guy really knew our parents. After playing for a while, he told us he was getting bored though, and he asked if we wanted to come play at his house instead. He had a Nintendo and a PlayStation we could all play with together. We told him we would have to go and ask our parents, because we were only supposed to be there for about an hour, and time was almost up. He told us that was fine, but we could play for a little bit longer if we wanted to, which of course we did. Right in the middle of playing Shark Attack, and him grabbing my sister in the air, a car pulled up to the gates of the park. I could hear someone screaming, "What the hell is going on here?" I saw my dad and my cousins jump out of the car and start screaming at the guy, who had already hopped onto his bike and started to ride off. My cousins, my sister, and I were all dragged to the car by our parents, with them yelling at us, asking in English and Polish what we were thinking. They started to yell even more when we told them the guy said he'd known them, and that's why we'd been playing with him. 9 years later, I found a website for registered sex offenders. I looked up all of the ones around my area, where I now live in Indiana, and around all of my friends' houses as well. After I was done with that, I looked them up by my grandparents' place too. There had been a sex offender literally 3 houses down from my grandparents' house, and it was that very same guy from the park. I don't remember what it said his charges were, but it's so scary to think he could have kidnapped all of us, or ruined our lives in the park that night. I was 14 when this occurred, and I'm 22 now. I still remember it in crisp detail though, and it freaks me out to this day, thinking what might have happened if things had turned out just a bit differently. School was out for the summer, and I had convinced my mom to send me to Russia for a couple of months to visit my grandparents. We'd moved to North America when I was little, and I hadn't ever been back much since. Plus, I thought it would be fun being on my first trip abroad all by myself. She agreed, and off I went on my first solo transatlantic journey. My grandparents are very great people, and have always spoiled my mother and I rotten. They were ecstatic their only granddaughter wanted to visit them, so they planned a fun vacation of their own with me for a month after I arrived, to a popular beach resort city in Turkey. We were to stay at a 5-star resort in Ankara for 2 weeks. I thought that was spectacular, getting to travel to not just one but 2 countries in a single summer, and to a fancy exotic place like Turkey at that. I was dying to go. Full disclosure though, when I arrived to Russia, it was not really what I had been expecting. My grandparents are really protective people, so I couldn't do much or go anywhere by myself. That meant it got boring pretty fast, and I spent most of my days just playing PSP in my room. I was very accustomed to being active, you see, and I wanted to do lots of things like go jogging, which I'd done every day at home. I gave my grandparents a bit of a hard time about that, since they wouldn't let me go alone, and naturally they couldn't keep up with me due to their age. After about a month of this, the time came to go to Turkey together. I was super excited to finally get some freedom and a change of scenery. I had been pent up at home for far too long. The resort they had picked was sprawled out over a fairly large area. However, it was all very well secured and isolated from the rest of the city. There was also a huge garden on the property as well, which was very well suited for jogging. This time, I also had my own room separate from my grandparents too, so I took the opportunity to go off by myself and explore the grounds a bit. Most of the time, I would jog in the mornings when it was a bit cooler. I would go with my big old iPod, so I couldn't hear anything that was going on around me. I figured it was really safe since it was a really nice hotel with lots of tourists around as well. Then, I started to notice him, a pretty innocuous-seeming gardener in his late 40s or early 50s, wearing this dark green uniform. I remember he kind of reminded me of like a shriveled old date from too many years in the sun. He would always wave or say something in broken English as I passed by, while he trimmed the shrubs or mowed the lawn. I would politely wave back, smile, and nod, but didn't really pay him much attention. Fast forward to about 10 days of this, and now I was really enjoying myself. It was fun to swim in the pool and the sea, the food was really great. And my grandparents had eased up a lot so I could do a lot more by myself. They didn't know about my morning runs in the gardens though, and I was not going to tell them because I was sure they would not approve. One morning, around 7 a.m. while I'm jogging, I see that gardener again. This time though, it's clear he's trying to get my attention specifically. He waves at me and yells something, so I stop and pull out my earphones, trying to figure out what he wants. Now, I know he works for the hotel, so I didn't really suspect anything. He waved at me again and motioned for me to come a bit closer. I was very confused, but I figured he wanted to tell me something, so I politely approached him. He was standing at the edge of a trail that went deeper into the gardens and off into the foliage. He was smiling and gesturing, and I could see he was holding something in his hand. I noticed he was holding a rose and extending it to me. At this point, I was confused and a little bit freaked out about what the hell he was thinking. I stayed put. Usually, the hotel staff there were chatty but nice enough. My grandparents would always get pulled into various conversations with them about things. I figured this was something of the same like. I didn't want to be rude, but I still wanted to be on my way without offending this old man. He handed me the flower and I took it, thinking maybe he wanted to show me some roses that were in bloom or something. He kept waving and gesturing like he wanted me to follow him, and stupidly I walked a bit closer. He had another flower in his hand and backed away more. Then, suddenly he stopped and started to lower it a little. That's when I noticed he was holding his other hand behind his back, and he was clearly holding something. I looked up ahead to the trail to see this little hidden-away cabin type thing where I assumed they kept their gardening supplies. Something clicked in my head then, and I began to slowly back away. The man saw me do that and tried to smile, then moved the hand he'd been holding behind his back while lunging toward me. I saw he was clearly holding some kind of rag. Without hesitation, I dropped the rose he had handed me, turned around, and sprinted at full speed. I didn't even stop to look back. I just ran like mad back to the hotel. It was not until the doors closed behind me, and I was among other people, that I looked back to see if the man had followed me. I couldn't see him anymore, though. My heart was beating like crazy. I went back to my hotel room and waited for my grandparents to wake up. I never told them about any of what happened that day, and spent the rest of my vacation glued to their side. I thought if I'd said anything, they would get even more paranoid about my safety and blame me for wandering off on my own. Also, I really loved them and I kinda didn't want to ruin the remaining days for them. I saw the gardener once more on the beach. I remember seeing him talking to a security guard. I grew very uncomfortable and sunk into my sun chair as I saw him. He looked over to me and smiled. I scowled at him as he mouthed the word Rosa tauntingly and smiled again. I still remember the anger bubbling in my stomach and how much I wanted to cleave his face in. I just froze there and stared though. He walked away, and I went back to pretending nothing ever happened. Needless to say, I never went on any more morning jogs, and neither did I want to until long after that summer had ended, and I returned back home. A while ago, I was staying at an upscale hotel in the safe area of a large Midwestern city. I'm a 16-year-old female, and I was in a room all by myself, with my parents just a few doors down. In theory, this was not unsafe by any means. I just happened to have some bad luck on this particular trip. Our first night there passed without incident, me in my room and my parents in theirs. I watched a pay-per-view movie and ate way too much from the snack bar. I didn't have any reason to feel unsafe. The next morning, we did the usual tourist stuff one would do when visiting a new city. As we ate breakfast in the hotel restaurant, I noticed a man who looked to be in his 60s or so, staring at me for an abnormally long amount of time. I won't lie, as a young, decently attractive female, I was used to getting the occasional inappropriate look every now and then. I just ignored it and chalked it up to him either being a perv or thinking I must have looked like his granddaughter or something. The next night, my parents allowed me to meet up with a friend for dinner who happened to live in the area. He met me in the hotel lobby, and we had a very nice dinner, then went back to the hotel for drinks. Yes, I was underage and I did have a drink. Shoot me now. Coincidentally, though, I noticed that same man who had been eyeing me earlier was at the bar as well. This time, he was giving me a very creepy vibe. Even with my friend next to me, his eyes traced over every curve of my body. I felt unsettled, and I mentioned this to my friend Ethan, who glanced over also. He too seemed to be weirded out by just how obvious this guy was being with his leering. We left the bar quite quickly, and by now it was around 12:30 a.m. Ethan walked me to the elevators of the hotel, and once I pushed the button, he left me. I wish I would have asked him to stay, because no sooner than he had walked away, my creeper came rounding the corner and stood there waiting with me for the elevator. I felt so uncomfortable knowing that he would be seeing what floor I was going to. It hadn't occurred to me to get off at a different stop at the time, and even if I did, he planned on following me obviously, so that would have been just as bad a move. As we got into the elevator together, I tried to keep my eyes averted from his, but I could feel him just staring at me. He kept on trying to step closer, and I kept backing up, too scared to even speak. What freaked me out even more was that he hadn't pressed a separate elevator button. This meant he planned on getting off exactly when I did. When I got to my floor, I almost sprinted to my room. The man just stood at the end of the hallway, waiting to see where I was going. I stayed in my room for about 15 minutes until I was sure the man was now gone. I ran and told my parents what had just happened. They were freaked out and told the hotel staff as well, but there was no sign of the man now. It was quite late, so I just locked my door and tried to get some sleep. I had almost drifted off when I heard a loud knock at my door. I'm not an idiot. I've browsed so many of these types of stories for such a long time that I knew not to go open the door at 2 a.m. Instead, I turned on a light and froze in place. I don't know if it was my intuition or what, but somehow I knew it was that same guy. I was near tears, but the knocking kept continuing, harder and harder. Finally, I shouted out and asked who it was. The voice that replied to me was the most chilling thing I've ever heard. High-pitched but growly, almost giggling. It's so disturbing I can barely even describe it. "It's hotel staff. Please let me in." I was terrified. A look through the peephole confirmed it was that same creepy old man. I locked myself in the bathroom and called my dad's phone. He had a habit of always keeping his ringer on, so he answered almost right away. I tried to tell him what was going on through my tears. "That guy from before, he's at my door." That's all I managed to say. What happened next gives me nightmares. My dad naturally went into superhero mode and opened his door, only to find the old man in a single robe, masturbating. It was pretty obvious to piece together what he was planning. I still dream about and have severe PTSD from it. My dad slugged the dude in the face and made sure he didn't move an inch while my mom called hotel security. We pressed charges, and the guy is now in prison. I believe with what are assault with intent to commit rape charges, but I could be wrong. So last year, my friend/neighbor and I were outside in the front of our yards, enjoying the fireworks on the 4th of July. We were enjoying the sights and sounds that filled that warm summer night air, but something was not right. Across the street from where we live, there's this old abandoned house. Because of this, I can say for sure this person we saw was not a neighbor or anything like that. In front of this abandoned house, we could see what looked like the figure of a man standing there right by the side. The house was owned and taken care of by friends and relatives of the people who used to live there, so we figured maybe he must have been one of them, even though he did not look familiar to either of us. I couldn't really see much since it was so dark, but he looked like a white guy with long, badly kept hair. He seemed rather tall as well, with a very thin-sized body build. We ignored that guy though, and went back to running around and looking at all the beautiful fireworks. From my peripheral vision though, I could catch some sort of movement by the abandoned house across the street. The man was still there, but this time I noticed he was slightly closer than before. My friend and I went by her house, and I told her that the man was clearly trying to approach us or something. I really didn't think this guy meant well. As I was in the middle of telling her my suspicions, he started to move very, very slowly toward the street, with his vision focused right on where we were. We started to freak out and ran inside her house. I spent a few minutes, maybe 10 or 15 there. I was a little scared to go home, honestly. After a while, though, I thought, man, fuck it, I'm only a house away. That guy must have lost interest by now. I go back outside, only to find the guy is still across the street. This time though, he's back in that exact spot he had been when I first spotted him, just staring at me. Maybe this guy wasn't really a creep or anything. Maybe he was hurt or lost or sick or something. I looked over to the man and called out, "Sir, do you need any help? Are you alright?" The man just continued standing there, showing no signs of having heard me at all. I stood there hoping a response would come, but there was still nothing. At this point, I was feeling very uneasy about this man. A minute or two passed by after I called out, but it felt like hours. I just couldn't take this anymore. I highly doubted he wanted any help, and at this point I just wanted to go home and forget all about this. I quickly sprinted to my house. I was on the porch hoping my mom would open the door quickly. I was banging on the door. I look back to where the man is. He's walking across the street, right in the direction of my house. My mom finally opens the door, and I sprint inside. I don't know why I didn't think of telling her. I suppose I didn't want her to freak out or anything. My other friend called me, and I talked to her for a while, hoping to calm down my nerves just a bit. A good 20 minutes had passed by at this point, and out of curiosity, I took a look outside the window across the street. The man was once again standing in the front yard of the abandoned house, staring at mine now, completely still in that first spot, just watching. I locked all the doors and let my dog inside. I grabbed my phone and waited in my room hoping nothing would happen. When my dad got home, I felt a lot more at ease. By then, it had been an hour or so since I'd last seen him, and sure enough, when I looked outside, he was gone. I never saw him again in that neighborhood either. I don't know if I overreacted, but as the old saying goes, it's a lot better to be safe than to be sorry. A couple years ago, during the summer after my junior year of high school, my friends went to the beach to see the 4th of July fireworks. A bit of background information. I lived a county away from my friends and wasn't familiar with the area around that beach. Only one friend, Shelby, lived anywhere near it either. The others lived much further inland. None of us could drive at the time, so we walked several miles to the town beach from Shelby's house before the fireworks. We were making our way back in the late evening around 10 o'clock or so. There's a certain distance from the beach where the crowd from the fireworks always disperses as they make their way down all the side streets at around the point where the major shops in town are. We had to keep following the straight road through the center of town though to get back to Shelby's house. The streets were mostly empty at that point, with only a few stragglers and the occasional cop at a very busy intersection. There were 4 of us in total. Shelby, Amber, Hannah, and myself, walking in rows of 2 with our arms linked together. We had had a really good time that night, and were still feeling kind of giddy and goofy. Hannah was my partner, and Shelby and Amber were walking behind us. We were on a bit of a stretch of road with no side streets, with a bunch of smaller shops on it. Everything was closed due to the holiday and late hour. We noticed a group of a few men, around their late 20s or early 30s, standing on the sidewalk outside an empty gas station. They didn't move to get off the path when they saw us walking toward them, which I did think it was a bit odd. It was a holiday and they were obviously pretty drunk, so we stepped off into the street to just walk around them. No big deal. One man grabbed Hannah's arm while we were trying to pass by though, and asked if she had a cigarette on her. None of my friends smoked at the time, so we very honestly said no and continued to walk, once Hannah managed to pull her arm away. The man was fairly tall and well-built, and we were all pretty short. We were a little bit startled, needless to say, but we tried not to make too much of it as we walked down the street. We even made a few jokey comments about it once we were far enough away. Several minutes later, Amber and Shelby fell a bit behind, because one of the crappy flip-flops Amber was wearing had broken off her foot. Hannah and I didn't notice at first, and kept walking along, until next thing we knew, Shelby and Amber were leaning over our shoulders, whispering that the man from the gas station who'd tried to ask Hannah for a cigarette was following us just a few yards back, none of his friends in tow. We were all a little bit freaked out at this point, but we decided it was possible he just happened to be going in the same direction. We decided to pick up the pace and continue down the street to be safe. At this point, there were intersections that started appearing every few blocks or so. We switched to the other side of the street at one of these and kept on going. We thought we probably had nothing to worry about anymore, until Amber looked back over her shoulder at the next intersection and saw the guy was now closer and on the same side of the street as us once again. We switched once more, and the man switched with us. The third time we switched, the man didn't. Instead, he just started walking faster on the other side of the street. A bit after the intersection, a big commercial truck was parked on our side that blocked the view of most of the street in front of us. Something did not feel right to me, so I made everyone hang back for a few moments, and we stopped a couple of yards away from that truck. Lo and behold, I saw the gas station guy quickly run and cross in front of the truck and head down the side street next to it that was between two shops that were already closed for the evening. Shelby started swearing. We turned around and ran back to the intersection, then back down the street that intersected that street we had been walking on. We were only one empty train parking lot away from Shelby's house now, so we kept running full tilt down the street. Once we were halfway through the lot, she explained to us that the side street he ducked into wasn't even a real street. It was just a dead-end alley between the two restaurants. Nobody familiar with the area would ever walk down there on purpose, but it would be the perfect place to go if you wanted to get the jump on somebody walking by. Luckily, in the end, we made it back safe and sound. I've worked at GameStop for about 4 years now, and in multiple places as well, some of them sketchier than others. I'm a key holder there, and I often close the store, so I'm normally out at around 10 p.m. or so. The last 2 years I've been at a rather nice GameStop in a better area, so I had discarded some of my habits I had accumulated over the years for my own safety. I'm about 5'3" and very small, so I'm an easy target for unsavory things. Anyway, it was about 10 p.m. or so, and I had just closed up shop with the other employee. I didn't have a car, so I had to wait for my ride for a while instead. This was not out of the ordinary, but tonight she happened to be running a little bit more late than usual. Usually whoever I'm close with would always offer to wait with me until my ride showed up, but I always assured them they could just go on their way and everything would be fine. The GameStop I work in is in a decent-sized strip mall/plaza with many other stores, including a Walmart. Most stores closed a little sooner than us, so we were typically the last ones out anyway. The associate I'd closed with walked across the lot and to his car, got in, waited about 5 minutes, then left and waved on his way out to me. As he did this, I waved back, when I noticed another car a bit further back in the lot. It happened to be the only car left. I assumed it must be someone else getting out a little bit late. My eyes followed the associate's car all the way to the end of the plaza until he was gone. I checked my phone and saw my batteries were low, but I could see that it was about 10:10 now. I was sure my ride would be here any minute, but that's when I saw the other car begin to move. They must have been sitting there, because no one had walked over to the car since I had left my store. They didn't turn on their headlights either, which was quite odd to me. It started up that gut-wrenching feeling. It was a little bit weird. I felt like I should leave right now. Still though, it's not like I could just walk home. The car drove around the lot and then slowed down, right near me. At this point, I had my phone out just in case, and I had my messenger bag on my shoulder, in case I'd need to ditch it fast. The person pulled up about 15 feet from me, just outside the first handicap spot. The car stopped but was still running. It was an old, gross, beat-up two-door with rust all over. The door opens, but no lights come out. Out steps a very large man, almost 6'2". He had brown, messy hair and was fairly lanky. His clothes were stained with grease or sweat, and he looked very unwelcoming. He had just casually gotten out of the car, then turned around and clicked his front seat upward. Immediately, with the door open, he started sprinting to me. I hadn't even realized at first, but I was already on my feet backing away from the man. He kept eye contact and made a gesture to come back. Basically, from there I turned around and booked it to the Walmart parking lot. The sketchy guy ran back to his car, pulled around, and started driving toward me. I did not know him. The store had been closed for over an hour now. It was pitch dark and the lot was completely empty. There was no reason to be approached like this. Still, he had his headlights off, which absolutely terrified me. I could hear him behind me, but it was still dark. My heart was pounding in my ears. I couldn't tell if he was right behind me or to my left even. I peeked back only to see him slowly driving toward me. At this point, I was certain I was about to be shoved into this car and sold into human trafficking or some shit. I was in an absolute panic, but what else could I do but run? The Walmart was still so far away. I was sure he would try to make an effort to get me in his car by then. I felt like he was driving slowly beside me to tease me and scare me. Just then, I noticed a big truck in the very back of the Walmart lot, with 5 people surrounding it. It was another car and their hoods were up. Someone was jump-starting a car. I hauled ass in their direction, since they were closer than the Walmart. As soon as I felt I was in earshot, I started screaming for them to help me, and that a car was behind me chasing me. The group looked shocked. For all I know, they could have been sketchy too, but that was just a chance I had to take. A man and a woman ran toward me and met up with me. I was pretty nervous and shaken up, winded, and could hardly talk. I looked back, and I could see the taillights of that car driving away. I walked toward the rest of the group, which was a few people attempting to jumpstart another car. I told them a huge guy had been following me, and I felt very unsafe. They offered to call the cops, but I had been unable to see his place in the darkness. And really, I just wanted to go home. They offered to give me a ride to Walmart, which I politely declined under the circumstances. The 2 women of the group and 1 man were kind enough to walk me into the Walmart though, and even waited with me for my ride to arrive. I thanked them profusely and went home. After that happened, I requested to open for about a week, so I wouldn't have to be at the store after dark. The next day, I also told my boss the time it happened, and we both watched the DVR in the back. It was incredibly uncomfortable to watch, but we did forward it to the local police. The police didn't end up finding much, but they now keep a squad car patrolling the plaza from 9 to 11 p.m. I don't take chances anymore. I wait inside the store until my ride calls me and is in sight. I was bothered for a little while, even though I feel I was lucky. I always felt like that type of thing only happened in the city or in unsafe places. Not to me and not here. I haven't discussed this much, but it still bothers me. I guess you're really never safe. Okay, so years of watching and reading about true crime has led me to be extra cautious and always on the lookout for people who are out of place or acting odd. I believe this has helped me from several bad encounters, and this is probably the worst of them. I was a junior in college at a local university that was located in the city. The campus was about a mile wide, and I lived just over a mile away from it. I lived in an apartment building that was owned by the university, so only students lived there. It was known as the Poor Kids Apartments and was the farthest from campus. It was also in a fairly bad part of town. The apartments had recently had issues with break-ins, so I was extra cautious about who I held the door open for. The door to the elevators was one that locked when it closed, and only people who lived there had the keys. Sometimes, though, people held the door to save you needing to grab your key. It was about 6 p.m. one night, and I was just returning home from class. I had planned on just stopping at my apartment and then leaving to drive to my mom's house for the weekend. I worked about 40 minutes away near my mom's home, so I tended to stay there on weekends anyway. As I was approaching the elevator door, I noticed that someone was holding it open for a group of us. As I was walking towards it, I noticed one of the people he'd held it open for did not appear to be a college student. Not only was he much older, in his early 40s or so, but he looked homeless, for lack of better words. He was extremely dirty and was wearing dirty clothes as well. Obviously, he stood out to me, but apparently not to the other people in the elevator, because no one was really watching him except for me. I watched to see what floor he would push when he walked in, but he didn't push a floor button at all. Big red flag right away. I was on the very top floor, and I was one of the last people to enter. I noticed I was the only one to push that floor button. Fuck, if this guy didn't get out on the lower floor, he was definitely up to something. As the floors started to open and people started to get out, I noticed he was now looking right at me, not getting off at any of the other stops. Before long, it was just me and him. I had to think fast because the fact he didn't press my floor but had entered before me, and the fact that he appeared out of place, were both huge red flags. I decided I would let him out of the elevator first. Then he would have the choice of left or right. If he chose left, I could run right and get to my door. I got my key ready and let him out. He hesitated for a moment, and I pretended to be stuck looking for something in my purse. He got out and went left. Awesome. I head right and sprint right into my apartment, which was located fairly close to the elevator. I glance back just as I'm walking in and see him standing in front of a random door, looking at me. I went into my room and locked the door right away. I grabbed the few things I needed and kept thinking about how weird that was. I almost started to let myself think that maybe he was dating someone in one of the other apartments. I started to try and rationalize his behavior, but I knew this was just strange. I grabbed my things and headed back out. I made sure to double-check the hallway before going to the elevator as well. It was empty. Thank God. I get back in the elevator and take it down to the lobby. I go to get out, when who do I see getting in with a brand new group of people? That same guy. What the fuck? Now I knew for sure he was not supposed to be here. He saw me, and his eyes grew wide immediately. I went to pull out my phone because I knew I couldn't just let him wander around here. I was about to call the cops while walking out of the lobby when I ran into the security guard who watches our building after a certain time. I told him everything I'd seen. He decided to contact the police and have them waiting for the man when he got back down. He said he would go up and try to find him as well. He told me I did the right thing. I still felt bad that someone else could have potentially been in danger. I hoped he was only a thief and not some sort of rapist or murderer. I didn't hear anything else about it after, and never ran into that same security guard again, so I can't say what happened for sure. I'd luckily caught a good look at him, so I hope my description helped find him at least. He might have known I was going to do something though, and aborted his mission before he got caught. Either way, I always tell people to watch out for stuff like that. Stuff that we always call red flags around here. This happened last year in October, so pretty much 3 months ago or so. Technically last year though. Anywho, my girlfriend and I decided to make a Walmart run. She was having nuclear-like cramps and demanded I take her to get some ibuprofen. And you never say no to a woman who's on her period. It was already late and we got back at around 2 a.m. We live on campus as we're both college sophomores. I park in a parking garage that's about a 5-minute walk away from our dorm, so it's not very far at all. I parked on the 3rd floor, but the exit was on the 6th. We decided to take the elevator instead of the stairs. It was a Thursday morning now, so everybody was in bed pretty much, or out drinking. Thirsty Thursday can get you like that. The campus was unusually silent because of this. As the elevator doors opened, there was a man standing inside. I was a bit taken aback at first. This man was a hulking giant. I'm talking 6'5", 280 pounds, and extremely muscular. He had that stereotypical resting look of "I'm going to fucking murder you." I didn't move myself, but my girlfriend could have taken on an entire army of Nazi troops with the way she was feeling. She got in right beside him, and I followed behind. We rode up to the 6th floor, and the guy began to make some pleasant small talk. He asked about our majors, where we lived, how we liked the school, and if the curriculum was good. He was a pretty decent fellow, all things considered. All the while, I'd forgotten to press the button of where we were supposed to get off. Instead, we just rode the elevator up to the 9th floor with him, which was the parking garage office sector. There were nothing but offices up there. My girlfriend and I awkwardly laughed about this. When we got to the 9th floor, though, we expected the man to step off and head out. Instead, he just stood there. He waited until the doors closed and said he'd follow us down to make sure we got out okay. Suddenly, I was very creeped out. I could tell my girlfriend was now too. She tucked herself behind me. I'm only 6'1" and 170 pounds with all the arm strength of SpongeBob SquarePants. Instead of hitting the 6 button, he randomly hit 3. In my state of shock, I just blankly stared at him. My girlfriend realized what he'd done and immediately tried to hit the 6 button, but we'd already passed by that floor. She reached out again, but this time the man grabbed her hand. His face immediately changed. The man was no longer pleasantly smiling or grinning courteously like before. The look of malice on his face will haunt me until this very day. I intervened and pulled my girlfriend's hand back. The elevator arrived on the 3rd floor, and my girlfriend and I bolted out of there. Luckily, that was the same floor we had parked on. The man in the elevator even tried to give chase for a few feet, but once we'd reached my car, he sprinted off around a corner. We drove to the campus security station, which was about a 1-minute drive from the garage, and told them what had happened. It wasn't even an hour later that they had caught the guy and arrested him. He was out on probation, but also had drugs in his system, and was just pretty fucked up in general. Of course, that didn't stop my girlfriend and I from making late-night trips after that, though. It did freak us out for a while, and we stuck with taking the stairs henceforth and forevermore. I was in Taiwan one year when I was younger, and had traveled to a busy night market. These are popular gatherings that usually operate in the evenings. Nearby, I spotted a sign for a net cafe in a 5 to 6 story tall building. Thinking I'd fire off some quick emails, I walked into the dark, small entrance of this building. It seemed this building was a lot older than the others around and hadn't been well maintained. I suppose that wasn't too out of the ordinary in Taiwan, though. The entrance was just a dark hallway that led to a small elevator. I pressed the elevator call button and entered. This elevator was uncharacteristically new compared to the rest of the building, but I didn't take too much mind of it. Unlike some Chinese buildings, there was not a 4th floor on the button list. It's considered bad luck since 4 sounds like death. This meant the only buttons available were 1, 2, 3, 5, and 6, which were all the usual fare. I looked for the floor the net cafe was at, 6th, the very top floor. I pressed that button. It lurched into action quietly and began to ascend upward. When the elevator stopped, I figured it was on my floor, so I instinctively began to step out. Right before taking another step, though, the sight outside the elevator stopped me in my tracks. It was pitch black, only lit up by the light in the elevator. It looked like this space hadn't been occupied for decades. There were random pieces of furniture strewn about, covered with white cloth and similar things. It was a fairly small building, so each floor was single occupancy. I could see pretty much the entire floor from in the elevator. I was thinking I must have got off on the wrong place, so I checked the light that's supposed to indicate which floor you're on. Strangely, there was nothing there. None of the indicators were lit up. The floor button to the net cafe was still lit as well, so I knew I hadn't reached that floor yet. All of this happened within just a couple of seconds. That's when I noticed a figure moving in the distance of that floor. It was not very visible, but I could make out what looked like a person dressed in some kind of gown, slowly moving toward the elevator. I was thoroughly creeped out. I started pressing the door closed button as fast as I could. As soon as I pressed it though, the elevator light flickered off. I was this close to pissing my pants. It's actually kind of freaking me out just even thinking back on it. The lights flickered back on in under a second, and the door closed. The elevator jolted back to life, and a few moments later it opened like it was supposed to the Net Cafe. I was beyond relieved at this point. I walked out immediately and sat down at a computer. After gathering up my wits a bit, I walked over to the cashier's desk and told them what I'd seen. The girl working there listened to me, and her face turned a bit ashen. I asked her if she'd heard of a similar experience. She told me she had never experienced it herself, but some coworkers and occasional customers had brought it up before. Basically, the building has 6 floors, and that 4th floor had a history. Apparently, that floor used to be a hair salon of some sort, until one of the employees killed herself there for some reason. She slit her wrists over the hair wash station and died. The store continued operations, despite stories of weird appearances. When the customers got their hair rinsed, the water would sometimes look a little red, like the customer was bleeding from their scalp. It was just little things like that. And then a couple of people reported seeing someone's figure walking away in a mirror. Naturally, the business closed down a few months later. The building owner tried to re-rent the place out but never had much luck. Most businesses there are quite superstitious, and no one wanted to rent the 4th floor after someone had died in it, even at an extremely cheap price. Finally, after dropping the price to nearly nothing, a stationery supply store wanted to rent. During the renovations of the floor, however, several accidents happened. Tools would end up in strange places. A mirror from the previous business shattered when no one was near it. And finally, a worker had his hand jammed between the elevator doors when it closed on him unexpectedly. The workers refused to continue working, and finally the business left. The building owner finally gave up and shut down that floor altogether. He had the elevator company come in to replace the panel, so the elevator could no longer arrive on that floor. Let me repeat that. The elevator was programmed to not go to the 4th floor anymore. It didn't even have a button for it. But for some reason, sometimes when people take that elevator, it would stop on the 4th floor. The doors would open, and some, like myself, would report seeing a figure walking around in the dark. This happened when I was about 8 years old. For reference, I'm female. I grew up in an apartment complex with about 20 buildings, each around 25 floors high. Each floor had 4 apartments, which made about 2,000 apartments in all. Each building had a car park underneath with an elevator, and a flight of stairs that went from the car park to the roof. My apartment was on the 5th floor of an apartment building right in the middle of the complex. I used to take the bus home from school, and it would drop me off at the corner across from the complex. I'd have to cross the road and walk home. One day, I had gotten off the bus and crossed the road when I saw some neighborhood kids had drawn a hopscotch on the footpath just outside. I loved hopscotch, so I dropped my bag down for a moment and started to play. On my second go, though, a lady who looked to be in her mid-20s came over to me and asked if she could play as well. I was a naturally shy little girl, but I was also very polite, especially to adults. I gave her my stone and let her have a go at it. Once she'd had her turn, she asked if her friends could come play as well. 3 guys, all in their mid to late 20s, rushed over. This really freaked me out. As I said, I was very shy, especially of males. I was aware now that I was alone with them, and I felt very uncomfortable suddenly. I told the lady that they could continue to play without me, but now I had to go home. She gave me this sad puppy look and said she hoped we could be great friends. I really didn't want to hurt her feelings, but I was pretty scared at this point. I lied and told her I would take my school bag home and come right back. I picked up my bag and hightailed it out of there. When I got home, I thought that would be the end of it. I'd never see them again. I was scared of getting in trouble from my parents for talking to strangers, so I didn't tell them about what happened. The next day, that lady was waiting for me, though, at the gates to the complex. She told me she was very sad I had lied and not come back, and I'd really hurt her feelings. I said I was sorry, but my mom had made me do my homework. She asked instead if we could play now then. I looked around and saw her friends waiting by a van. She told me they wanted to take me to have ice cream at Kiki's. Kiki's was this new place that had just opened nearby. Each ice cream came with a toy, and all my friends at school had at least 2 each. My family couldn't afford to go there ourselves, so I'd always kind of felt left out, and now this lady was offering to take me. I knew I shouldn't go with her though, so I told her thank you, but I couldn't go today. At that point, she got really angry. She said I had to go with her. Being a timid kid, I hated being yelled at, so this freaked me out and I started to cry. The lady said she was sorry and gave me a hug. Then she tried to lead me to the van, saying an ice cream would make it all better. At this point, I pulled away and started to run home. This time, they followed me. I could hear them all running after me, and I knew they were faster than me. I figured I'd have to hide from them. I flew into the underground car park of the building closest to the gate and hid between 2 cars. I heard them run down the ramp and stop. Then I heard the lady calling out to me. "Oh, you like hide and seek then, huh? Let's play. Ready? We're coming to get you." I was shivering violently. I knew they would find me there. I decided I'd get to the elevator shaft, take the elevator to the top, then run down the stairs a few floors and take it back down. Maybe they'd see the elevator stop on the top floor and assume I was hiding there, so they'd waste time searching there while I got away. The elevator was on the other side of the car park. I had to go around 2 corners to get there. I crept along the wall, staying as low as I could until I was around the corner. Then I bolted for the elevator. The elevator was in a small room that had this gigantic door. I got inside, but the door wouldn't close all the way. I pressed the up button and watched as the elevator slowly descended, stopping at nearly every floor. I crept over to that big door and peeked out through the crack to see where they were. I spotted them just as I heard the elevator bing from behind me, and without thinking, I used all my strength to close the door. As I said before, that door was huge, so it made a big noise as it closed. Even as I ran into the elevator, I knew they'd know where I was now. The elevator was full of people though. I squeezed right to the back, hiding between 2 boys and a girl I'd seen around before. The girl lived in my building but on a different floor. I watched the elevator doors closing, praying they would hurry up. Just before they did so, a hand shot between them, and they opened again. The woman was standing there, looking furious. "Get out here!" she yelled. An elderly woman asked what the matter was, and the woman said I was her daughter and I'd run away. I was too scared to speak up as the woman grabbed my arm and started trying to drag me out. Luckily, one of those boys sensed something was wrong and stopped her though. He asked if I knew her, and I shook my head and started to cry. The girl from my building picked me up, while the boy demanded the woman leave me alone. Since the elevator was full of people who now realized what was happening, the woman and the guys sprinted away. The girl from my building and 2 of the guys in the elevator walked me home and told my parents what had happened. The police were called, and after some investigating, it was found out that the woman and the men were child traffickers. I'm so grateful that boy realized something was off and stepped in. Who knows where I'd be if he hadn't that day. A few years back, my husband and I were living in an apartment in Brooklyn. One night, we decided to check our neighborhood's sex offender registry and discovered an offender lived in our building. It wasn't really a big deal to us, as we didn't have any children at the time, but I should mention that this guy was one creepy-looking dude. I'm talking about those wild hair, crazy eyes kind of creeper. You know, the real scary kind. We would often see the guy walking around the building or the neighborhood every now and then. He even set up a fruit stand for a while, and would wildly yell at people as they passed by. He never really bothered us though, so we mostly didn't give him a second thought. At the time, I was working a pretty crazy job where I would be at work really late every night and have to take a taxi home at the end. On those nights, my husband would stay up late and wait for me to arrive home. I was a bit brain dead when I would get home after a 20-hour shift, so sometimes it would take me a while to find my keys, and my husband would have to let me in. One night, I had texted I was leaving the office around 3 a.m. About half an hour later, my husband could hear our door handle jiggling. Assuming it was me, he got up to go let me in. Something, however, made him look out the peephole first. There he saw him, the sex offender, completely naked, standing on the other side of the door. As soon as he sensed my husband looking out, the man stopped jiggling the handle. He looked up and put his eyeball right up to the peephole, trying to gaze in, as if he could tell my husband was looking at him right now. For some reason I don't really understand, my husband opened the door. As soon as he did this, the guy tried to force himself into the apartment. Eventually he beat the man back and got the door closed. Then he called me. I was about a mile away from our building when I got that call, and I was terrified. It must have been quite obvious, because as we arrived to the building, the taxi driver asked if he should walk me to the front door. I told him yes, I would very much appreciate that. He stood with me until my husband came outside to walk me in. We lived on the 6th floor, and from the moment we went in, you could hear someone running up and down the staircase. We ran to the elevator and jumped in, pressing the door close button over and over until it started to move. When we got to about the 3rd floor, the floor where the sex offender was at the time, he began to bang on the elevator doors trying to get in. We heard him run to the staircase and start running up the stairs to catch us. When we got to our apartment, I called the cops to report this terrifying situation. It took them 2 hours just to arrive, and by that time the guy had already picked up his clothes and gone home. The cops didn't even come inside the building. They made us go outside and didn't even get out of their car. When I explained what happened, they simply responded by saying, "You live in Brooklyn, get used to it." Eventually, we moved out of that building, but whenever we go back to that neighborhood, we still see that guy at his fruit stand, yelling at people as they walk by. This might not be your typical scary story, but it disturbs me to this day, so I'll share it with you. I was about 14 years old when this happened. I was in my bed trying to fall asleep, but as always, I was failing at that. My dad was in the living room trying to rock my brother to sleep as well. It was a normal routine, but this night was anything but normal. I finally thought I was about to fall asleep when I began to hear these loud, frantic knocks on my front door. It echoed through the entire house. It was about 3 a.m. at this point. The knocks were immediately followed by a girl screaming, "Help, please, my mom needs help!" over and over. She was practically shrieking. My dad assumed it was some sort of trap. They use a little girl, dad becomes vulnerable, opens the door, easy access inside the house, and so forth. He was yelling back at her to leave us alone through the door. I could hear the girl crying, kicking our door over and over again. Her screams still ring in my head every now and then. By this point, I was sitting upright in my bed, crying as well. I was terrified and upset with my dad. What if this girl really needed help? Maybe 10 minutes go by of this continuous crying and screaming when I hear a man outside my window. It was only a few inches beside the front door where the girl was. I could hear the man telling the girl to shut up. I heard him grab her. She was screaming for him to let her go. I felt sick to my stomach. I wanted to look out my window, but I was paralyzed with fear. I could hear him dragging her into the street. Her screams for her mother became quieter the further they got. Soon after, I heard about 3 cars speed off down the street after a lot of people were yelling, I assume at each other. My parents called the police and tried to get me to fall asleep, but I was too scared and traumatized. To this day, which is about 3 years later, I still think about that little girl and her mother all the time. I think about what might have happened to them. I used to want to know, but now I don't think I want to, as bad as that might sound. I don't really know if we could have done anything to help. This story happened to me when I was about 7 years old. We lived in a relatively big town in Russia. Towns, unlike villages, are known for their tall, multiple apartment buildings. I wouldn't dare call them skyscrapers, but some of them were known to go up to the 24th floor or something. Ours, for example, had 9 stories, and our apartment was on the 8th floor. Just to give you a bit of an idea. A detail you also need to know is that each floor had 4 apartments, 2 on each side separated by the staircase. This separation left room for a tiny hallway. Some people would claim this hallway theirs and install a door right at the beginning of the hallway to have extra protection for the 2 apartments on the side. Our apartment had that extra hallway, and the door installed was wooden and very old. When we first moved in, we were curious to see who our neighbors in the apartment directly to the left were. Turned out it was a family of 3, a mother and her 2 sons in their late 20s. She worked really hard to provide for those sons, who seemed very healthy at first. Tall, lean, talkative. Although I couldn't really grasp the idea of an addiction or drugs in general, I remember being repulsed by the idea that we lived right next to heroin junkies though. They seemed harmless enough since their mother provided enough to get them what they needed, but I did remember stories of them stealing on occasion or climbing into their apartment down from the roof whenever they forgot to take their keys. One day I overheard a conversation that their mother would not be able to make enough money anymore. This meant the family was going to be looking for a cheaper place to stay. I can still make out that woman's facial features. She always looked so tired and sad, but she tried her best to smile whenever she saw me. Although we didn't initially agree, our grandmother moved into their empty apartment a couple of months later, and I started to like it more, being able to step out of our apartment and just go see my grandma whenever. The wooden hallway door protected us from the stairway and provided a sense of having a huge family in one house, even though I was the only child at that time. My parents were fairly busy people. My mom ran a business and my dad was an engineer. My grandmother had already retired, but she had a good piece of land out in the village that she used for gardening, so she too was very busy keeping her crops alive. Although I was fairly little, I was raised to be a responsible and aware human being. I hate stereotypes, but when it comes to crime in Russia, I must admit they're quite true. The idea of having a babysitter was not widely spread until the 2000s or maybe later, so whenever my parents had to leave, I would have to take care of myself. Sometimes I would go and visit Grandma, but when she was gone too, well, let's just say I didn't complain. I would watch cartoons and talk on the phone a lot, and even eat jam straight out of the jar. This day was one of those days. I'd just turned the TV on and gotten my party started. As always, I turned up the volume and attempted to sing along and dance to the music. I was all by myself, so I was going to enjoy the hell out of it. That was until I was startled by a loud boom. A typical sound the door to my grandma's apartment made. It was a bit old but modified from the outside with some kind of leather cushion. It provided a bit more insulation, but also made it a lot more difficult to open or close the door. You had to really yank it. Otherwise, you couldn't do anything. I felt a little bit embarrassed for my loud, goofy singing, so I turned off the TV and went to see if my grandma had just returned home. I knocked on her door. Nothing. "Grandma, you home?" I asked so she'd hear me coming. Still nothing. I grabbed the keys for her door and opened it slowly. "Grandma? Grandma, are you here?" Even though I had a feeling she was not home, a strange sensation creeped through my body. I was completely sure I'd just heard her door slam, but it seemed like nobody was there. I looked around and didn't see anything out of the ordinary, so I did my best to shrug it off as me just hearing something. I went back inside our apartment and continued to sing to myself. A couple of minutes later, though, I heard that same noise again. Trying not to freak out, I turned off the TV and went to see if my grandma was really there this time. Maybe she'd left very quickly because she'd forgotten something, and now she'd actually returned. I know, but I had to calm myself down somehow. Again, though, nothing. She was not home. I went inside again and made sure to turn the lock 3 extra times just to make sure. I was waiting for the 3rd time, my heart pounding, and I could hear it beating in our quiet apartment. I was terrified because I knew now someone must be trying to mess with me. I couldn't figure out how this noise was happening, or where they were, but I knew they wanted to be inside. I heard that sound once more. A little more quiet, like they were trying to be sneaky, but still loud enough to make a note of it. Terrified to even look out the peephole, I looked at our hallway once I managed to catch my breath. Nothing. A couple of seconds after that, I had the courage to slightly open our door and look outside. Just like I'd seen through the peephole, everything seemed to be fine in the hallway. Everything was fine with our door, my grandma's door, our hallway door. Wait, what? One of the locks on the hallway door was hanging out with only one screw left. The other, a smaller one, fell down onto the floor. The steel latch was completely bent in. I honestly don't know how I didn't pee myself. Seriously. I ran to the door with the broken locks and tried desperately to secure it somehow. A couple of seconds later, though, I realized nothing could be done. I ran back inside and locked the door tight. Even though I'd been taught to call the police in case of an emergency, I called my friend from the same building first, hoping her father would be there. He was, luckily. Crying and sobbing, I explained my situation best I could, and he showed up immediately. His presence seemed to have scared off whoever it was, and I felt relieved. The locks had been destroyed, and so was the hallway door. It was made completely impossible to repair. That day, we called the door company and ordered an installation of a heavy iron door instead. You remember me telling you about those former neighbors? Well, apparently the family was doing worse and worse financially, so those junkies became regular visitors at police stations for theft and other minor crimes. This time, one of them must have remembered where they used to live, so he thought it would be easy to break in. The door in the hallway was weak, so it would eventually give way. They just didn't expect me to be home. I can't believe those were the same people who'd acted so friendly and seemed harmless. They did eventually catch the one that tried to break in, but I never quite got rid of the fear of being alone in a place somebody tries to break into. I occasionally have nightmares that portray exactly that. So when I was just off to college out of high school, I, female and 18 at the time, moved in with my good friend Karen, 20, and her friend Tara, 21. We moved to New York City, but as rent is wildly expensive there, we wound up getting an apartment in the shadiest part of Harlem. It was a fairly decent place though. A doorman clinched the deal for us. The neighborhood was shady, but was normally alright. Not really a big deal, we just ignored the cat calls during the day, and didn't really leave the apartment at night. Tara and I really hit it off from the beginning. She knew a bunch of fun places to go drinking, where they wouldn't card me down in Manhattan. I hadn't really been doing that well emotionally lately, and she decided I could use a fun night out. We said what the heck, screw it, we're going out then. Karen was back in our hometown that weekend, so she wouldn't be there with us. We got all dolled up for a night on the town and wore these stupid heels we would both later really regret. So Tara and I took 2 subway trains to this nice karaoke bar, where good people get up to perform and we just watched. We enjoyed the drunk theater people on their night off. Tara had a few drinks, but I had a few more than that. I was having a tough time walking in a straight line back to the subway by the end of the night. Still though, we were laughing and really glad we'd had a fun time together. Then we got on the first train home. We were sitting there waiting to reach our stop to transfer, when we both noticed this young guy with his hood all the way up over his face at the other end of the car, a few people down. Now, that wasn't super unusual for Manhattan. We tried to ignore him at first. It started to get a bit awkward though, as we could tell he was staring at us unrelentingly. We were dressed up, and some people just stare in the city, so whatever. Ignore him and he'll eventually go away, right? We finally get to our stop, and of course the guy in the hoodie followed us off the train and to the stop for the next one we were supposed to catch. Alright, maybe still a coincidence. In a city of 8 million people, odds are someone is going to be going the same direction you are. Nevertheless, we kept a much closer eye on him. We didn't want to jump the gun with our accusations, but this was starting to feel really sketchy, especially with how much he was eyeing us. We were just trying to mind our own business, particularly as Tara had to keep me from tipping over every so often, which broke the tension and made us laugh for a moment. On the next train, though, we were the only passengers save for one other person, as well as that guy in the hoodie once more. We stayed absorbed in each other's company, giggling over some pictures on Tara's phone, hoping if we didn't pay attention to this guy he would get his fill of staring and decide he was no longer interested. Hopefully, especially if we laughed and made it look like we weren't afraid of him. At one point though, I glanced back at him because I couldn't help myself, and saw what looked like a piece of metal poking just barely out of the sleeve of that overly large sweatshirt. The man saw me looking, and we looked at each other in the face for the first time, maybe for a fraction of a second. The focus of his stare was so intense. His gaze was totally calm and confident. I looked back at Tara and widened my eyes, flicking them towards him in a sort of, holy crap, look at this guy, communication. She did. I was watching her face the entire time. I saw all the color drain as she too noticed that knife hidden up his sleeve. I didn't know what to do. It wasn't a good idea probably to call the police just then right in front of this guy in an abandoned subway car, and we were almost at our stop already anyway. When we got off, our apartment was about 4 blocks from the subway, so the way I figured it, we had a much better chance of getting home than of the police getting there to help us by the time we pulled in. As soon as the train stopped, we started to get out. My drunk ass immediately reached down and slipped off my shoes while walking towards the stairs to the street. Tara didn't bother, but was already halfway up. I turned around to see where the hoodie guy had gone, and there he was. He was strutting confidently toward me, his eyes completely deadpan, but never moving focus from me. I felt like I was going to vomit from fear. My stomach was twisting so much. It suddenly felt like I hadn't had a single drop to drink. I ran up the stairs behind Tara, and we both just let loose down the street. My mother had given me some pepper spray in a little bottle that looked like lipstick. It was a housewarming present. I tried to unzip my purse and get my hand inside while we were running, but with the state we were in, that was next to impossible. It was slowing me down, too. I gave up and hoped I could get it out if he managed to catch us. When I looked back again, of course he was running too. Only now he was no longer hiding his knife. It was right in his hands as he pumped his arms furiously. It looked like one of those big switchblades too. Totally illegal. I kept glancing back even though I was running almost full out at this point, trying to keep Tara next to me with her heels still on. Maybe it's because I was so damn scared at the time, but it seemed like running was nothing to him. He was still so calm, barely even breathing heavy, and zeroed in on us. He stared straight into my eyes whenever I looked, and had this pitched little half-smile on his face. It was completely calm, not grinning or angry or any kind of emotion I could recognize, just a sort of casual, I'm going to catch you, you know, face. We ran past the usual group of homeless guys about halfway to our building, who made some kind of comment I couldn't hear. I assumed they were making fun of us when they saw us running toward them, especially since I had no shoes on in this gross part of the city. I have to wonder, though, whether they helped us waylaying the guy after, because we managed to get to our building and have the doorman buzz us in with moments to spare. We ran, panting and half crying, to the doorman's desk, staring at the doors the entire time. We had just enough time to start explaining in hysterics that we were being followed. Immediately, there was a huge rattle at the doors. The man was there, shaking the handles violently, trying to rip open the doors to get to us. The doorman whipped out his walkie-talkie and yelled at us to go upstairs. We didn't need telling twice. We got in the elevator and held each other, shocked and crying, hearing shouting from outside the elevator doors. It faded as we went up to the 3rd floor, where our apartment was located. When we got upstairs, we went straight to our balcony, which was on the left side of the building. We had come to the front door from the right, but we thought maybe we'd be able to hear something from there. We did. We could hear yelling. Just one voice, pretty high for a man's. Clear and furiously shouting "fuck" over and over. After maybe a minute, it stopped, and we didn't hear anything else. The police showed up shortly afterward for statements, but as far as I know, they never found the guy. I moved out of the city shortly afterward, for a variety of reasons. My dad kinda still feels bad about it. He thought that Harlem was a nice, cheap option. But it's alright. Everything turned out okay in the end, and I'm not living there anymore. Still though, I've always kind of wondered why he followed us all the way from downtown, and why he didn't try to attack earlier. How did we get away exactly? Why had he wanted to stab us in the first place? A huge variety of things. The cool, detached expression on his face, paired with those intense eyes, has stuck with me ever since. I'm a female, and I was 14 at the time this happened. I'm from a big city in Germany, and that afternoon I wanted to buy a birthday present for a friend. I planned on taking the subway downtown, to where all the shops were. Even though my home city is fairly big, it's considered really safe, so I never really felt unsafe going to friends' houses or downtown all by myself. While I was waiting on the platform, this guy kinda slowly walked past me and stopped just a few meters away from me. I remember he must have been in his late teens or early 20s, and he had these glasses on. While I looked around the platform bored, since the subway wouldn't arrive for another 3 minutes, I noticed the guy was now staring at me. Being a rather shy girl back then, I very quickly looked away. After a few seconds, I wanted to check if he was still looking, so I peeked a quick glance. Surely enough, the guy was still staring, completely unblinking. This went on until the subway arrived. By then, I was feeling really uncomfortable. Luckily, there had been a few other people on the platform, so I still felt fairly safe. I got on and succeeded in snatching one of the few empty seats left. Since it was close to Christmas and the subway was completely packed up, I couldn't see the guy from my seat anymore, so I calmed down thinking he must have lost me. A couple of minutes later, I got off at my stop and took the escalator up to the street. While standing there on the escalator though, I got a sudden sharp feeling up my spine and turned around. My heart sank. The creepy guy from the platform was standing just a bit behind me on the same escalator, staring into my back. I tried to calm myself down. This station was a popular meeting spot, and a lot of people who wanted to go shopping got off there. Since it was close to Christmas, he was probably just doing some shopping for his family, right? When I arrived on the street, I turned right, walked down that street, and turned right again at the next corner. When I turned the corner, I quickly looked down the street I had come from. The guy was following me. I felt really uncomfortable now. I entered a bookshop and hid behind a bookshelf, waiting for the guy to walk to wherever he was heading to. After a few minutes, I went outside, and that was the moment I started to panic. I thought the guy must have walked past. It had been a long time since I'd hid. It turned out, though, the guy was standing just a few meters away, just out of sight, waiting. I should have run back into the store and called my parents to come pick me up. Instead, stupid 14-year-old me hoped there must be a more logical explanation for this guy's behavior. Maybe he was just waiting for someone else. I got out of the store and walked in the opposite direction of where that guy was. I started to walk faster, hoping that if he was following me, I would lose him amongst all the other shoppers that were now around. When I turned right at the next corner, as I was walking around the block, I looked back down the street again. He was now even closer behind me. I walked even faster and I felt like I was about to cry, but I knew I had to keep calm. I turned right once more. When I looked back, and could still see him behind me. I was now positive he was following me. What other reason would he have to walk around the block entirely without entering any of the stores? I tried to think of a way to escape, when suddenly I saw my chance. The streetlight on the crossing just a few meters in front had just turned red, so I started sprinting as fast as I could. I managed to just barely make it to the other side before the traffic started flowing through. I looked back. The guy hadn't managed to make it across the street in time and was standing on the other side, waiting for the light to turn green again. He was still staring at me, but this time with a really creepy wide grin. At that moment, I felt as scared as I had never been before in my life. I started running again, this time into a huge department store a few meters away from me. Luckily, I knew that this particular store had another entrance at the back, facing a different street. On that street, there was usually a line of cabs waiting to pick up shoppers. I sprinted through the store and right out the other entrance. To my greatest relief, there was the usual line of cabs. I practically jumped into the first one. In tears, I told the cab driver my home address and shouted for him to go quickly. I frantically looked back to the door, expecting the man to burst out any moment. Fortunately, I didn't see him. I'm still thankful that the cab driver instantly started driving and only asked what happened and if I was alright when we were already a few blocks away. In tears and completely shaken, I told him about the man that had been following me and how scared I was. When we arrived at my parents' house, he refused to charge me and waited outside until I was safely indoors. To this day, I'm still grateful to that cab driver. I don't know if that guy who was following me was just playing a very cruel prank on me and just wanted to scare me, or if he had something way more sinister in mind. So this story didn't happen to me. It actually happened to my very good friend who we'll call Dan. Dan is a 5'10" man from Maryland. He had a very strange sense of humor and was a very smart but all-around good guy. Anyway, we went to the same university. I'm gonna tell this story as best as I can remember, so please bear with me. Dan moved into his dorm room before his roommate did our freshman year. Dan had everything all moved in and had settled in completely. Just as he sat down, his roommate showed up to move everything in. His roommate, we'll call him Brian, introduced himself and his mother and father, who were helping him move. He seemed just like any other person. Dan decided to help his new roommate move everything in, since he didn't know anyone yet and was from a different state. Dan and Brian's family get down to their car, as Brian stayed behind in the room to put things away. This is the first red flag in this story. As they were opening the trunk, Brian's father looked at Dan directly in the face and whispered, "Good luck." Dan thought he meant with classes. He said thanks and grabbed a box. But boy, was he wrong. Dan carried that box upstairs and into the room, where Brian proceeded to flip out. He screamed about how that box had his special ingredients for a project he was doing, and Dan had probably broken it. Weird, but everyone has their quirks. They finished moving Brian in, and his parents said goodbye. And again, Brian's dad told Dan good luck. It was really weird. Anyway, a couple of guys came by the door to ask if they wanted to go eat. Dan said sure, but Brian stayed behind to finish unpacking his things. While Dan was out, he got a call from Brian, asking if he would mind if he smoked weed in the room. Dan, being that he wanted to work for the CDC, said absolutely not. Brian screamed something unintelligible and hung up the phone. He called back a few minutes later and asked if he could smoke weed in the closet at least. Again, Dan said no. Brian hung up without a word, and Dan and his friends decided to go make sure he wasn't actually smoking in the room. When they arrived, they found him hiding in the closet like a goblin eating the weed. Weird as hell, right? Not even close to as bad as this will get, though. As time continued on, at night, Brian would wake Dan up by standing beside his bed, standing over him, then asking him a single question. Dan would answer, and Brian would walk back to his bed and fall asleep. This happened every night for a week. At this point, Brian had moved in an entire toolbox full of wrenches, screwdrivers, hammers, nails, screws, an assortment of power tools as well. These weren't the kinds of things you'd need with you in a college dorm room. During this entire week, Brian also never left the room. The only time he would move was to eat and go to the bathroom. About 4 days before the week where dorm room changes could be made, Brian woke Dan up in the middle of the night and asked him how he felt about gay people. Dan said he didn't really care what anyone did, and it was fine with him. When Dan woke up the next morning, Brian was sitting in a chair directly by his head, staring at his sleeping face. Of course, he instinctively yelled out, "What the fuck are you doing?" Brian replied, "I think I'm starting to have feelings for you. You need to move out. I don't want you getting hurt during what's coming." After that, Dan left and didn't sleep in his room for a couple of days until he could move. Unfortunately, though, there were no open rooms, so he couldn't. During this time, Brian started to follow Dan around. He would sleep in the closet with his tools, making something. Dan eventually convinced the head of the dorm to let him move into the now empty room next door, after 3 weeks in what he described as pure hell. Dan moved to the room next door, so no big deal, right? Wrong. 2 days later, Dan got a knock at the door at 9 a.m. Thinking it was Brian coming to fuck with him, he screamed out, "What the fuck do you want?" He answered the door in his boxers. At the door, though, there were 4 state police troopers in full hazmat gear. The man in front said, "Not who you were expecting, huh?" At least someone there had a sense of humor. They let Dan put some clothes on, then led him out the door. At the end of the hallway was Brian in handcuffs. Turns out Brian had been building pipe bombs and other sorts of explosives in the dorm room while Dan was away at class. After Dan had moved out, he took over the other bed and the closet for his bomb-making activities. The reason the hazmat team was there was because Brian had spilled liquid mercury all over the floor, and they were afraid it had seeped into the other rooms. When they went through all of Brian's things, they found a plan that also had guns hidden around the city. This kid had planned a massive attack. On a special note, though, he had written Dan's name down with a heart drawn around it, and wrote specifically, "Do not kill." Brian is obviously in prison now. I'm a girl who's been living with 2 guys just off my university's campus in an apartment for the past year. I'm going for my 3rd year in college currently. I go to a college that's out of my home state, so I had to stay off campus because I couldn't afford to keep moving my stuff back and forth between my house and the college dorms. I met these 2 guys last year through a friend of mine when I was looking for somewhere to live for the summer and the upcoming year as well. I was a little bit apprehensive about living with 2 guys, but my friend really vouched for them hard. And the rent was really cheap with them as well. I figured, why not? What could it hurt, you know? I decided to live with them. It was actually really nice. They were super nice guys, and they really liked having me around too. I helped them keep things clean and tidy, and there wasn't really any awkward advances for sex or anything like that. They never harassed me, which was really the only worry I'd had, and we had a lot of fun together actually. Fast forward a year and we decided we were going to stick together as roommates, but we were going to move to a different apartment. One of the guys, Alex, was going to be out of town during our planned move-out time, so we decided a couple of days ago for all 3 of us to move out his room and some stuff in the living room. We just wanted to get a jump start on moving things into public storage, you know? That day, we were moving things around, packing things away, putting junk into boxes. At one point, while the guys were moving the real heavy stuff, I started organizing Alex's dresser. I was taking the drawers out and putting them aside so I could carry the frame easier. As I was taking out one of the drawers, though, his underwear and socks one, something caught my eye. It was a bra, but not just any bra. It was my bra. I recognized it immediately because it was not one of those casual Monday going to class ones. It was a super expensive one that was one of my favorites, and I thought I had lost it long ago. I didn't really think too much of that though. I figured probably I'd just left it in the dryer or somehow it got mixed into his laundry. No big deal, right? Out of curiosity though, I sifted through the drawer a bit more, and underneath that bra were 2 pairs of panties. Yes, both mine. A slow chill started to come over me, but I decided to give him the benefit of the doubt. Perhaps I'd just been in a brain fog or something and he'd found all these mixed into his laundry. It was too awkward for him to just return them to me. I get that, it can be like that sometimes. I shook it off and convinced myself that must be the case, and went to continue to move his things. I found another pair in another shelf, and then even more. Some I didn't even recognize anymore, which again gave me the creeps. Now I was curious, and even though I felt guilty about it, I just had to look through the rest of his clothes. I closed his door and started peeking around a bit more. I really wish I didn't. I went deeper into the first drawers I'd pulled out, and found yet more pairs of my panties, but underneath those were pieces of photo paper with pictures of me on them. My heart stopped when I saw them. Holy fucking shit. There were tons of these small 4x6 photo cards, all of me, all of pictures I figured he had taken from my Facebook or other social media. Maybe I would have given him the benefit of the doubt if it weren't the fact that they were all either bikini pictures or some other sexy photo of me, at Halloween in a costume, a photo showing cleavage, etc. I quickly slipped the pictures and the pair of underwear back in and covered it up with all his things. At this point, I really had no idea what to do. I was so confused and scared, and I really didn't know how to react. I took out the rest of the drawers and put them with the others. As casually as I could, I called Alex over and asked him about the first bra I'd found, the really obvious one in his underwear drawer. He turned bright red and stammered something about the laundry, as I figured he might. He then kind of probed me and asked if I'd found anything more. My heart was thumping, and I shook my head no. I smiled and thanked him for finding that piece of clothing for me. Immediately, he said he'd finish up his room and basically kick me out and forbid me from entering, which really sealed up my convictions. I don't know what to do about this, honestly. It's been a few days since, and now that I've kind of calmed down, I'm really not certain about rooming with them next year. Still though, it's a lot of paperwork to go through canceling the lease and all that legal stuff. He's kind of a nice guy otherwise, but it's really creepy. A couple of years ago, one of my closest friends relocated cross-country with his long-term girlfriend to work a job he just couldn't refuse. Only issue he had was that he didn't want to fly his dogs out with him when they made the move. They'd be staying in a hotel for the first month. He was also a bit reticent to fly them out due to health concerns for both pets. By the time he located a home to rent, he was missing his furry buddies and made the request of his sister, another close friend, and myself to drive them to him to LA. Now, we're all Chicago folks, so the trip would be quite a long one. However, with the three of us to foot the nearly 30-hour drive, it would be a piece of cake. We left early and drove extremely long hours. Along the way, it was decided between my friend and I that we'd foot the majority of our drive ourselves. If we needed to, we'd let our friend's sister do a little bit of driving. We were on a bit of a time crunch due to a snafu with the rental agreement, so we didn't have the luxury to stop very often past an 8-hour stay at a Denver La Quinta Inn. As for the journey itself, it was relatively smooth, barring getting pulled over right before entering Utah for driving 2 miles in the left lane of an empty highway. Oops, I guess. From that point on, we made it through Utah, Arizona, and Nevada without any trouble pretty much. That was until we entered California, in dire need of some gas. I had been driving for the majority of the first day, and tagged my buddy in after being pulled over. I remained in the shotgun seat as navigator, searching through the GPS for a fuel stop. We kept our eyes peeled for road signs and discovered a sign pointing to Yermo Ghost Town or something along those lines, which seemed to have a mobile station. Well, that was great. It was convenient too, as it was located almost directly off the interstate. We rolled in with little more than fumes when we approached the pumps. Normally, we'd let the dogs out at every rest stop, but having stopped not long before then, and with both dogs sleeping snugly in the back, I decided to pump gas without anyone else leaving the vehicle. My buddy pulled us up on the side of a beat-up green sedan with a short, plump gentleman who just turned in to approach the shop. I noticed a few other hoopties at the humps, all unoccupied, and there were a couple of other cars parked up near the station, most likely belonging to the employees. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary until I swiped my credit card. The pump rejected my first swipe attempt, which I chalked up to a misread. I swiped it again, only for the pump to read out, "Please see attendant." I was annoyed, but we really needed the gas. I tapped on the window and told my buddy what I was doing and asked if anyone needed anything. After taking their orders of Gatorade and Marlboro Reds, I walked up to the store. I took a mental note of how strange this gas station was. It was eerily quiet, especially for a station just off the interstate, but no matter. As I walked in, there was a bit more weirdness. The first thing I noticed was that there were boxes of chips just kind of lying all over the floor, like someone was in the middle of stocking shelves and just gave up. As I veered to my right, I noticed immediately that no one was milling about this place. There were 6 cars besides our own out there, so I felt like I should see someone. Things got even weirder when I realized there was no one behind the counter either. No customers, no workers. Then it dawned on me. What had happened to that gentleman who was at the pump adjacent to mine? Surely all of them can't be in the bathroom. This is where I began to feel this gnawing sensation in my stomach. Something was not right here. I've always been a person who felt like I could trust my instincts, and those instincts were currently screaming at me to get the hell out of there. I wanted to turn around and run, but instead I held back. Surely it would look suspicious booking it out of a gas station that was empty. I decided to just try and play it cool. Natural, you know. Don't let your body language let on how badly you're freaking out in your head. I was probably only inside the station for a couple of minutes when I left, but I stopped just before exiting to listen for something, anything. Even a flushing toilet would have been a good sound right now, but there was no noise at all. As I exited the shop and saw the car, I began to feel a sense of dread. It was almost like one of those fake-outs in a movie where the hero's about to make it to the end but the celebratory fanfare disappears and then silence comes and something strikes them down. I was about 25 yards from the car when I see this gentleman just appear from around the side of the shop opposite me. It was not the same guy I'd seen while pumping gas either. He was much larger, and he had this very peculiar look on his face. The best way I can describe it was like Nick Cage's smile from Face Off before the titular act occurred. I continued walking toward my car, but when I looked back to him, he was now walking toward me swiftly and with purpose. At this point, I noped my way back to the car with increased urgency in my step. Of course, my friend had the door to the car locked like a complete douche clown. The 95-pound golden retriever was also sitting in my seat. Apparently, my companions did not notice how freaked out I was, or the creepy gentleman currently running in our direction. I punched the window and told them to unlock the fucking door right now. My friend only half rolled down the window to tell me the dog was in my seat, and they were afraid she'd just jump out when I opened it. I reached my hand in and threw the dog backwards as hard as I could, while my friend was just now realizing how freaked out I was. He started the car and drove off right away. I took one last look back, only to see Nick Cage had stopped about a pump away from where we were, still with that same look on his face. We drove a bit further and found another gas station further down the road, this time with a ton of people inside and out. After thoroughly creeping out my friends with the story as I pumped gas, we made our way back to the interstate, which meant passing that gas station again. It had been about 15 minutes since we'd pulled out before. We went silent as we noticed all those very same cars were still sitting in the same spots we had left them, but there was still nobody around, and the man had disappeared as well. After thoroughly freaking out for a few miles, I received a phone call from my credit card company about a $100 charge at the Mobile station. The lady on the phone was luckily really helpful in fixing the situation for me and was entirely creeped out by the story as we were. In the end, we made it to LA and had a pretty great vacation. It still bothers me though. What the hell was going on at that little gas station off the highway? And what the hell was that smiling man's story as well? About 3 weeks ago, my mom told my brother and I this story, which straight up gave me the yuckiest feeling. Sally is a lifelong family friend. Sally would frequently visit her friends and family in Oklahoma. We all live in a small town in southern Ontario, Canada. Sally would drive there, and she would drive straight 20 hours at least, overnight to get from our town to another small town. She did this simply to save money really, and obviously wanted to arrive as soon as possible. Now that you have that prelude, here's the story. About 30 years ago, she decided to head south for a visit like normal. No big deal, she'd done this many times before. So she gets packed up and heads out. At some point, after driving about 14 to 15 hours, she started to get pretty tired. Being as this was probably around the 80s, it was a little safer, she decided, to stop at a rest stop. It was more of a traveler's stop as well, my mom said. She would sleep there for a bit to gather her energy and resume her drive first thing in the morning. So she parks in this very well-lit and busy rest stop. She parked right by the lights as well, and felt at ease because there were an abundance of travelers stopping and going. She got out for a bathroom break, came back, and settled into her car. About then, an RV pulled up beside her, and an elderly couple got out. The man asked her about coming from Canada, and they struck up a pleasant conversation. Nothing too odd. The couple just talked to Sally for a bit. They told her they were driving from the south going north, and just needed to have a rest for the night. They wanted to talk because they were unsure if this was a stop that was okay to stop at overnight, but seeing Sally, they were put at ease. The pair said goodnight to her and bid a good trip, and the couple went back into their RV. Sally locked her doors and went to sleep. Around 2 to 3 hours later, though, Sally woke up with this really unsettled feeling. She looked around but couldn't see anything. A few people going into the stop, the parking lights were all on. She assumed the feeling was because she was tired, and a car wasn't the best place to sleep in. After 10 minutes of waiting for it to go away, though, she says this feeling actually got way worse. It was just a jarry, queasy, uneasy feeling. She sat back and tried to shrug it off once more. This didn't work, and apparently she had every red alarm and instinct telling her she needed to go now. She panicked, started her car, and peeled off. She didn't care where. She just knew she had to get away from that place. About 20 miles down the road, she found a motel and a gas station/restaurant stop. She decided to see if she could get a room for what little money she had. She conversed with the person in charge. He cut her a deal, as he didn't want a young woman driving alone at night, and she got a key. She popped into her hotel room and slept easy for the night. No issues and all in peace. Around 9 a.m. she woke up, showered, changed clothes, and decided to relax for a few. She pops on the TV, and what was on it gave her chills. There was a breaking news story about an elderly couple who had been killed in the middle of the night. The news showed the RV that Sally had been parked next to, that exact spot, at the exact same rest stop. She even saw the fast food drink cup she had dropped on accident that had rolled underneath her car. Sometime during the night, a man had broken into their RV and killed both of them, then left. That was presumably right before Sally had left as well. The man was never caught. Since then, Sally has always stopped at hotels for the night and avoided rest stops altogether. I think I was about 18 years old when I first joined the online dating community. One of my friends had convinced me to sign up since I had just gone through a terrible breakup. I was still technically in high school, but only about 2 months from graduation. As I was clicking through one of the dating sites on my phone, I came across someone who seemed decent looking enough and fairly normal based on what I could tell from his profile. It said he was the son of a local cop, whose name I'll leave out because he's well known around these parts. We'll call him Officer V. We'll call his son Ren. Ren had just moved in with his dad from Florida and was looking to meet some new people. We chatted online for a while, then decided to meet up and go for a walk. We met up at a local ice cream shop and then walked around the downtown area getting to know each other a bit. Now, right off the bat meeting him, I was not super into him. I know nerves can get the best of people though, so I decided to give him another chance. I was a member of the marching band in high school, and we always did the local parades for Memorial Day and such like that. Well, Ren and I had been texting all day talking about meeting up for a picnic or some such after I was done with those parades. When I told Ren we were just finishing up and I needed to get home and get clean before we went out, that's when things took a turn for the creepy. He insisted on picking me up from the end of the parade, and after 10 minutes of arguing, I finally convinced him that no, he would not pick me up, and would in fact wait for me to change and get cleaned up first. After I was done getting changed, I gave him my address and said he could come pick me up if he'd like. Not even 3 minutes later, he was already waiting outside. When I hopped into his car, I smelled something awful, something that can only be described as rotting and dead. I'm a messy person, sure, but I've never let my car get that gross on the inside, much less letting a date see it in that state. There were food wrappers everywhere, dirty laundry. It looked as though this guy had been living out of this car. When I asked him what we would be doing for the evening, he said we were going out to dinner, but he wanted to show me something first. You see, we lived near the third largest national military cemetery in the US, and that's where this guy took me. I would have understood, being as it was Memorial Day, wanting to make a quick stop and pay respects to those who had served. But there was no paying respect being done here. We drove through the cemetery, and he pointed out every single grave he was even remotely related to. To make matters worse, we drove through 4 cemeteries. 4 of them. When we left the last one, I thought we could finally get on with the day. Boy, was I wrong. We went back to his house, and I asked if we were still going to dinner. Well, yeah, but we have to wait for my dad, Officer V. He's taking us there. I was a good kid and never got into too much trouble, but the thought of being stuck in a restaurant with a cop watching me was more than a little unnerving. Why hadn't the guy told me this in the first place? As we were sitting on the couch watching TV, waiting for Officer V to come home, R decided it was a good time to try to make a move on me. He leaned in to kiss me and attempted to say something cute before doing so. I immediately turned my face away because of the awful stench emitting from this guy's mouth. I've dated smokers before and cigarette breath didn't really bother me, but this scent was indescribable. It was like cigarette breath on steroids. That's the only way I can say this. Thankfully, moments later, his father walked in and announced he was ready to go. After a few brief questions about my age and making sure it was okay for him to take me across state lines, we left for dinner. The entire meal, R didn't say a single word. Instead, his father basically interrogated me. Thankfully, that dinner was short. After the meal, I texted one of my friends to tell her I needed a way out of this situation. I told her to call me and pretend to be upset. As it turned out, Officer V was dating her mother, unbeknownst to me. So Ren already knew who she was, quite well in fact. I told Ren I needed to go because my friend was really upset and needed my help. Well, he downright refused to take me back to my car so I could go home, even though the only way to get to her house was to drive directly past mine where my car was parked. After that, an argument ensued about him not taking me home. He dropped me off at her house instead, and I immediately jumped out of the car without saying goodbye or thank you. At this point, I was sure Ren must have gotten the hint I was most certainly not interested. I thought I would be in the clear. His tours of the cemeteries and refusal to take me back to my car so I could go home were huge red flags. I knew this was not someone I wanted to be dating, let alone have him in my life. I blocked him on the site and deleted his number as well. The following weeks got progressively creepier though. He would somehow call and text my number all the time, even though he knew I would not answer. He would come to the baseball games I worked at and just stand there watching me. A few times I even had to have the coach throw him out because he was bothering the team. He called me once and I had my friend screen the call and blatantly tell him I was not interested and to stop doing this. He still didn't get the hint. The calls and texts continued for weeks and weeks, and I would even notice him driving by my house at all times of the day sometimes. I only ever ran into him in person once after that, at a local bar and pizza shop. I was at the bar with some friends when I noticed him walk in. As he came up behind me to talk to me, I turned my head and clearly ignored him and acted like I had neither seen or heard him. He stood there for a few minutes in silence behind me, waiting. Then he just walked away, and I've not seen or heard from him since. My friend often tells me how creepy he still is, as her mother and Officer V are now married. Word is, Ren recently got married as well. I feel so bad for that poor girl. I just hope he isn't such a creep to her like he was to me. I'm a photojournalist in a pretty big city in the Midwest. Several years ago, when I was fresh out of college, I spent the winter doing a personal project on the homeless community in the city. Several weeks into working on the story, I started spending a lot of time documenting a sizable homeless camp that was just under an interstate overpass. It was also near a train yard, which conveniently was just over a mile away from my apartment. I got to know a lot of the people who stayed there pretty well, and never really felt threatened, except for one particular time. Throughout my time there, I knew who did and did not mind their picture getting taken, and whoever didn't want me to snap pics of them, I pretty much just left them alone. There was this one guy, Jay, who was camped a little farther away from the main camp than the rest. I never really bothered him, and some of the other residents told me he was very mentally ill. Either that or he was hooked on meth. It was best to just leave him alone, needless to say. Okay, fine by me. I never really interacted with him. One day, I was staying after dark to photograph a church bringing food to the camp. Jay had shown up that evening to grab some food. I ignored him and concentrated on photographing the others. It was starting to get dark, and the church group was just packing up to leave. At that point, though, I noticed Jay was still around and was shooting me these really nasty glares. He also seemed to be following me around the area while I worked, staring at me. Once everyone went back to camp, however, he was gone. A few hours later, I left to head back to my apartment. I was really tired, and one of the shortcuts back was to walk a little ways up the railroad tracks and cut through this path that wound through a tree line and came out just by my apartment building. I was about halfway up the tracks to the path, where there was a decent amount of light from a highway that ran parallel to the tracks, when I realized someone was following me. I turn around and sure enough, there's Jay. He was about 30 feet from me. I just about jumped out of my skin at the realization that this dude had been following me the entire time, and I hadn't noticed at all. Not really knowing what to do, I just blurted out, hey dude.
Hey, did you take my picture earlier?
No, I don't think so.
I'm pretty sure you took my picture.
I really don't think I did, man, unless you happen to be in the background.
Did you take my picture?
I didn't. I told you I didn't, dude.
Oh yeah? Well, let me see your camera then. You're full of shit.
I started to walk backwards as he advanced upon me. No offense, man, but I don't let other people touch my stuff.
So, you did take my picture?
No, I didn't. At this point, Jay started screaming and accusing me of taking his picture. He demanded I show him all my photos. I refused because no shit, I'm not gonna hand a $6,000 camera to a dude in a state of rage. After a few minutes, he went from yelling at me to some sort of psychotic fit. He started screaming this enraged babble and started closing the distance between us. I turned around to bolt, and Jay lunged after me. Lucky for me, Jay was not a very big dude. I'm about 6'1" and have a full contact karate background, so I instinctively popped him one and then bolted. He chased after me for a few moments, just shrieking out more garbled nonsense. Once I got to a light near the path, though, I turned around to look, and he was just gone. Shaken but quite relieved, I quickly made my way back to my apartment. I opened the door and was safely inside, when literally the instant I'd closed it, Jay smashed into it like a truck. Luckily, the door was latched, but he nearly knocked the entire frame out. I hit the floor, dropping my camera to the ground, then scrambled up the stairs and into my apartment, all while Jay was screaming this crazy nonsense shit, punching and kicking at the door. I called the cops, they came, and Jay was nowhere to be found. I just told him I'd heard someone trying to break into the building forcefully. Naively, I figured it would just fuck up my project if the cops turned up at the camp where several people were active users. Turns out, though, homeboy Jay was not just punching that door. There were marks where clearly some sort of edged tool was being used. I bet it was a railroad spike, because several other people at the camp would keep spikes with them for protection, and those tracks were just littered with them. Anyway, I didn't go back to that place for quite some time. I ran into one of the other people who had been staying there, though, and told them what happened. Ends up, shortly after this incident, Jay skipped town. Not even a week later, the cops came by the camp with his mugshot. Turns out he was wanted for almost beating another homeless person to death in another city. Well, I guess that explains why he was so paranoid about his picture ever being taken. My bet is he hopped on a train and rolled the rails out. He's somewhere else farther south, probably. Or honestly, hopefully he's dead, because I never want to meet that crazy motherfucker ever again. This happened in the mid-90s. I was about 5 years old when my family decided to go on a trip to Fiji over spring break. My parents, aunts, and uncles grew up there, so we weren't solely there as tourists. The first few days we stayed with relatives and got the local experience. It was honestly a lot of fun. It was mine and my older brother's first time there. There was a group of us waiting. Me, my brother, a handful of our cousins around the same age, and all of our parents. I was the youngest one. After visiting relatives, the adults decided to rent a beach house out for the remainder of the trip. We were all really excited about the view and being so close to the beach as well. The house was really big too. To this day, it's still the biggest and nicest house I've ever had the chance to stay in. Anyway, we swam, hiked, sat around a bonfire, did all the usual outdoorsy stuff. The first night was so much fun, it's deeply ingrained into my memory. The second night, however, the adults decided to go out for a few hours and leave the older kids to take care of us younger ones. They weren't going to be gone long. They said they would come back at 10 o'clock at the very latest. The house had a security system installed as well, so no one was really worried about anything happening. Plus, this was the 90s. Being the oldest of the kids at 17, my brother was left in charge. We had 3 cousins with us, 2 boys, 11 and 15 years old respectively, and 1 girl who was also 15. I was rooming with that female cousin. The boys were rooming together as well, while the adults had their own private rooms. As I said before, I was the youngest by a long shot. Anyway, us kids decided to go to the beach while the sun was still out, an hour or 2 max. We packed up our beach gear and took off. The house was still in view, and we didn't even stray too far away. Basically, we were still in the backyard. My female cousin, Joanna, also made sure to not let me out of her sight. In fact, she stayed with me and built sandcastles the entire time. We took a bunch of pictures on her disposable camera, some of which are still tacked onto her fridge all these years later. We're still really, really close, and I look after her young daughter all the time. The boys were out swimming and doing their thing, while Joanna, Eric, and I stayed behind and played on the beach together. Our plans for staying out only a couple of hours soon turned into 3. It was only as the water started to become a bit too aggressive that we decided to go back inside. Because my brother's a dumbass though, he forgot the key to the back door in his room, so we had to use the front door of the house. This required us to walk all the way around the gate down the dirt road out front. We packed up our shit and took off, all 5 of us. It was honestly really dark at this point. Joanna and I held hands the entire way. Eric was walking with us, while my brother brought up the rear, and my older cousin Dean took the lead in front. We kept quiet as we were walking back, all of us extremely tired from being out all day. Joanna and my brother exchanged a few words here and there, but I was so tired I had no idea what anyone was saying, and I didn't really care either. My only concern was getting home to sleep and playing my Game Boy. It was only as Dean slowed to a halt in front of us that I realized something was awry. There was a man seemingly walking toward us from the other side of this dirt road. I was very young at the time, but I remember this man's face very clearly. He was old, Caucasian, very tan, and adorned in typical male tourist attire. A tropical shirt, cargo shorts, sandals, a straw hat. His clothes were kind of straight out of a tropical getaway catalog. There were other houses in the area being rented out by people, so we all figured he must just be in a neighboring property, perhaps walking home or something. Even so, my brother cut in front of Joanna, Eric, and I, just in case. He slowed down at the same time the man did. The man introduced himself as Eddie and claimed he was lost, looking for directions to the house he was supposed to be staying in. The man was clearly under the influence of something, kind of glassy-eyed and wobbly, couldn't even stand still. There was a lot of swaying. For whatever reason, his eyes kept drifting over to Joanna. He would periodically look at her while my brother was giving him the directions. It was around this time that Joanna, who had been holding my hand, squeezed my tiny fingers inside her slightly bigger ones. I could tell this man was making her nervous. Even then, at 5 years old, I sensed there was something seriously wrong with the way this guy was looking at her. Eric, 11, who had been up until that point ignoring me the entire trip because he wanted to look cool in front of the older boys, grabbed my hand tight, and the 3 of us stood together shaking behind Dean and my brother. I couldn't really hear the words being exchanged. I just saw my brother gesturing as he was giving directions, pointing his arm back, to the left, whatnot. This lasted about 5 minutes before we were on our way. My brother made sure to walk beside Eddie for a minute, all the way past our shaky wall. Then he waved by and we carried on to our house. The older kids exchanged looks with each other but didn't say anything. In fact, we didn't speak of Eddie at all when we arrived back. We entered the house, showered, and met in the kitchen for something to eat. My brother cooked for us and we sat around the table, talking about how fun the beach was, when we heard a sudden knock at the door. Expecting our parents to be returning home, we didn't really think that much of it. The older kids were too lazy to get up and answer it, but Dean eventually caved in. He went over to the door, and I, being a curious 5-year-old, went with him. There were windows and a peephole on the door, where Dean could have looked, but he didn't. We weren't expecting anyone else. He unlocked the door and opened it, his body language turning rigid immediately as he locked eyes with Eddie. Within seconds, Dean was on the defense. He glanced back, motioning for me to back away and grab my brother. I waited a couple of seconds before doing so, catching Eddie as he asked Dean if he could come inside and use the phone in the house. Apparently, the walk was too far away, and it was killing his legs, so he wanted to call a cab. This was before the age of everyone and their mother having a cell phone, so showing up on someone's doorstep asking to use their phone was not necessarily too out of the ordinary. I skittered off to the kitchen and motioned for my brother to follow me. I guess he saw the mildly anxious look in my eyes, so he immediately dropped his food onto his plate and went out the door. Like Dean, his body went rigid when he saw Eddie standing there. The 3 of them spoke at the door for quite a while. Eddie was begging to use the phone, while Dean and my brother insisted they would not let him inside. If he really wanted to use it, he should wait until the adults arrived home and ask them instead. By telling him this, though, they had accidentally let slip the fact that us kids were all home alone. They must have been going at it for at least 10 minutes. By this time, Joanna came out to see what was happening. I remember she rocked back when she saw Eddie at the door, breath catching in her chest. She glanced at me and nodded for me to join Eric in the kitchen. Usually, I wouldn't have listened, but that night I did. I went back to the kitchen and told Eric what was going on at the door. Even though he was older than me, he got scared way easier. Even to this day, he's still very jumpy when it comes to horror movies and that kind of thing. For this reason, he swallowed the dry lump in his throat and yanked me back when I took off to see what was going on. Sometime later, Joanna and Dean returned to the kitchen without my brother. I raced past them, poking my head around the corner, to see my brother had let Eddie inside the house, standing with him as he used the phone. It was attached to the wall in the hallway. My brother leaned against the wall and kept his attention firmly on Eddie as the man dialed the number for the cab company and called one to our address. This took about a minute, after which Eddie thanked my brother and waved bye to me on his way out. My brother kept the front door open after, standing there and watching for a solid 20 or so minutes until the cab arrived and drove Eddie away. Our parents came home 10 minutes later, a car full of groceries in the trunk. As per my brother's request, we decided not to tell our parents about Eddie. If they knew we let a stranger inside to use the phone, they would have blown their shit. Rightfully so, but still, we were kids and my brother tried to sort the situation out as best he could. Plus, Eddie didn't really do anything per se. There was just something about him that was odd. The rest of the night went by without a hitch. In fact, 2 nights went by without anything weird happening. By this point, we had all forgotten about Eddie. At least I had. Joanna, on the other hand, kept a huge kitchen knife under her pillow just in case. I had no idea at the time. On the 4th night at the house, the adults cracked open the barbecue outside, and we had a little cookout in the back. It was a really good time, actually. It was good food, cold drinks, a deadly game of Monopoly, and even a bit of storytelling from my inebriated uncle. My parents told me I could stay up late with everyone and everything, which I hadn't been allowed to do the entire time we were there thus far. Suffice to say, we were all having a very good night. The stars were out, the waves were crashing softly on the shore, and the mosquitoes were biting the fuck out of us. My mother went inside to grab some repellent, and didn't return until a couple of minutes later. She went straight to my father after, without the repellent, and whispered something in his ear, a strange look on her face. The others noticed, eventually asking what was going on. She said a strange man had arrived at the front door, knocking repeatedly. My father and my sober uncle, Joanna's father, went over to check out what all this fuss was about. They answered the door, and there was Eddie. When they asked what he wanted, he kept on saying, "My buddy Will said I could swing by. Can I talk to my little buddy?" Will was my brother's name. I remember thinking that was so weird. The fact he kept referring to my brother as his buddy. The adults found it very strange too, needless to say. My father asked why he wanted to talk with my brother. Eddie just kept saying Will was his buddy, and he really wanted to see him. He was very clearly on something as well. Eventually, Eddie said he needed to use the phone again, and Will had let him use it last time. It seemed the jig was up. My father glanced back at Will as he came up to see what was going on. He gave him the "boy you done fucked up" look. He knew better than to let strangers in the house. But that was the thing. Eddie had a way about him. He was odd, but in a way that was kind of disarming, like he didn't know whether you wanted to knock him out or help him out. They both told Eddie he couldn't use the phone, but they did give him directions to the nearest convenience store where he could ask them. Eddie tried to persuade them into letting him use our phone, but they firmly told him he had to leave, shutting the door in his face immediately. Sometime later, we all settled into bed. Joanna and I stayed up a bit later, and she read me a chapter out of the young adult novel she had been reading the entire trip. It was Flowers in the Attic, in case you're curious. Certainly not the most appropriate novel for a child of 5, but I had no idea what any of it meant anyway. In any case, I fell asleep easily. A few hours later, I woke up to the hushed sound of Joanna's voice. She shook me awake hurriedly and said we had to hide in the bathroom right now. The look in her eyes was wide and full of fear. Without her even telling me directly, I knew this must be about Eddie. She took me by the hand and we locked ourselves in the bathroom. I noticed she kept on touching the back pocket of her jeans, but I didn't know why. I later found out she had tucked the knife in there. and felt for it every few seconds to make sure she still had it. We hid for about an hour until we heard the sound of the police arriving. I remember hearing their loud footsteps in the house and Joanna opening the door for them when they knocked on the bathroom to see where we were. I didn't know it back then, but apparently Eddie had snuck into the house while we were all sleeping. The boys' room was really warm that night, so the three of them had left the window open to get a breeze in. Apparently, Eddie had been waiting around the entire time and snuck in through the window and quietly climbed inside. Eric, the poor thing, was the first one to see him and scream bloody murder, waking up Dean and my brother. Eddie's eyes were completely bloodshot, twitching all over the place. Climbing in, he asked his buddy to help him find that sweet girl from the other night. He was referring to Joanna. Every screw in his head was loose. He began laughing, shouting, and telling my brother how they could take turns on her, amongst other obscene things. It's like he couldn't decide whether he was horny or angry. According to my brother and everyone else who restrained and held Eddie down that night, there was something incredibly off about him, other than the fact he had just broken into our house. The way he was talking, he was so delusional, as if he was fully convinced Will was his best friend, and Joanna was going to be his that night. It was really terrifying. To this day, my brother refuses to talk about it in detail. I think it has something to do with Eddie really truly believing they were like old buds who had promised to use Joanna like a rag doll and throw her away. This man was so fucking convinced. Apparently, their screaming woke the adults as well. My mother called the police, while my father and two uncles held Eddie down till the cops got there. Joanna's mother raced upstairs and woke her up, telling her to grab me and hide until further notice. We didn't know if Eddie had come alone either, but we were pretty convinced after a while. My mom checked if the other windows and doors were closed and locked. Then she took Eric upstairs and waited with him in the hallway, trying to calm him down while the cops arrived. Turns out Eddie had some mental problems. He had become obsessed with Joanna the moment he had seen her. She was exactly his type, young, of color, and unwilling. Oh, and we later found out Joanna wasn't the only girl he had harassed on this trip either. She was the only one whose house he snuck into in search of her, though. Who knows what would have happened if he climbed in through our window that night instead of the boys. It was December, and Christmas was just around the corner. It was late around this time, around 3 a.m. or so, I believe. I was sick, so I was on a very strange sleep schedule. I was extremely bored as well, and none of my friends were online. I decided to venture into a little site called Omegle. I went on there quite often at that time, mainly to troll people. Tonight, though, I decided to have some actual conversations. Big mistake. I decided to talk to some people under the anime tag, because people on there seem mostly cool generally. Of course, there were always horny teenagers looking for a girlfriend no matter what tag you're on. I eventually found someone who wasn't a bot, and didn't immediately ask ASL. We'll call her Azula. Azula started by asking me what my favorite anime was, and I jokingly replied Fat Albert. I knew I didn't want to troll, but I just couldn't help myself. Well, apparently that was a good start. A healthy and fun conversation ensued after about anime. She seemed like a really fun person to talk to. Then she asked for my email. I gave her my spam email, knowing there was no real harm in giving that away. We continued our chat in a Google Plus hangout. She started to ask me to video chat, which I declined, telling her that I didn't even do that with my real-life friends. Still, though, she kept on persisting, and I kept on telling her no. I was starting to think that she was actually some pedophile. I told her that I didn't feel comfortable revealing my face to anyone, and I really didn't want to voice chat. Then she told me she'd send a picture of her face if I sent her a picture of mine, so I let her send in hers first. I did a reverse image search on multiple sites to check if the photo was fake, but nothing came up anywhere. So I knew this was legit a young girl. Reluctantly, I took a picture of myself and sent it to her. I figured what harm could that do? She kept on persisting to video chat, but I kept telling her no. I then turned my computer off because I was tired and quite annoyed. I really didn't think that much about it. I was just planning on blocking her the next day. A day later, I hop on my computer and was just about to block her. As soon as I logged in, she messaged me immediately. At this point, I thought she must either be stalking my profile or had no life and was on her computer all day. I went ahead and talked to her a bit. She apologized for being pushy and explained that she really didn't have that many friends. She just wanted to get to know me better. I said that was fine. We talked about anime, video games, a pretty normal conversation for the most part. The next day, we talked again. She wanted to video chat. I told her I'd do a voice chat this time. Once we were in the voice call, she kept on insisting I turn my camera on though. She already had hers on, so I was sure she was not like some 40-year-old man or something. Still though, I didn't really feel comfortable doing that. She pulled out the reverse Uno card though. She wanted me to video chat to make sure I wasn't a 40-year-old pedo either. My voice was quite deep, so I understood. Reluctantly, I flipped my camera on. After that, everything seemed to be okay actually. I could tell there was something weird about her, but I figured it was just social awkwardness. After that, things were normal for a few weeks. One day though, she randomly told me she had a crush on me. I told her I don't do online relationships, and she got really depressed after that. She started telling me about how every guy she liked had turned her down, and she was really upset. I didn't know how to respond really. I felt bad because I knew how it felt to be rejected, and how awkward it was to stay friends after. So I made one of the dumbest mistakes of my life. I said I actually did like her back. Nowadays, there's no way in hell I would have lied like that. But I was 14 at the time and I didn't really know what to do. Basically, I was in a fake, fabricated online relationship at this point. I didn't consider her my real girlfriend, and only one of my friends, who we'll call Eric, even knew about her existing. In fact, one day he was in a group chat with us, and that's when things started to get strange. In the group chat, we had a decent conversation, but it got weird after I left. Azula started asking Eric really personal questions about me. Eric gave her the runaround, telling her she should be asking me all of this stuff. She was asking questions like what my last name was, where I lived. Eric didn't tell me about this, but I did see in the group chat. I thought it was really strange she would do that, knowing I would see them when I got back. Anyway, at this point she was really insistent on knowing my last name. She would not stop asking no matter how many times I declined. I found out she was going on Facebook, searching every single person with the same first name as me. I couldn't believe it. She spent like a week trying to find me. I had never seen so much dedication. The red flags were popping up at this point. She eventually did manage to find my Facebook and sent me a friend request. I declined it because I was pissed she was invading my privacy. She then started messaging me on Google Hangouts, talking about my family members. She literally wrote down a list of all of them, asking how I knew them and how they were related to me. I started to get really scared at this point. I knew I had a stalker, but I didn't know how to handle it. I blocked her on everything and deleted everything on the net that had my real name to it. I officially went dark. Eventually though, she emailed me on another email of mine. I don't even know how she found it. I'd never given it to her, so honestly I have no clue. Perhaps it had been on my Facebook before I deleted it, but I don't think so. Anyway, she spammed that email with countless messages per day. I blocked her and the email stopped. I didn't hear from her for about a month. Then one day, I accidentally deleted a fairly important email, so I go in my trash to recover it. In my trash, there were thousands of emails from her. I nearly soiled myself in fear. In fact, the last email was from that very day. So, in morbid curiosity, I read through some of these emails. What I discovered was nothing short of terrifying. She told me she thought there must be something wrong with her. She enjoyed and got off on the pain and fear of others. She told me she knew exactly where I lived, and she was going to fly over and be there with me, forever. I was so scared at this point. I was honestly worried she was going to come kill me. I deleted that email account, and went off the grid ever since. One summer when I was around 5 years old and my sister was around 8, we are both females by the way, I awoke to hear through our bedroom window my parents shouting loudly on the back patio. This was not a common occurrence, and when they did fight, it was not typically anywhere there was a chance of us hearing. This sort of thing did happen from time to time though, and though the situation was mildly unusual, we shrugged it off. We shut the window and went back to sleep. We promptly forgot about that whole ordeal. It wasn't until years later when we learned the truth about all that yelling. As a near adult, I overheard my mother explaining the situation to a family member in another room. Apparently, at some point in the night after my sister and I had went to bed that night, our parents had received an unusual phone call from someone using an electronic interpreter, the same type of technology a person who's deaf might use to make calls and communicate over the phone. Understandably, my parents were a little bit surprised. We didn't know anyone who would use this service to contact us. Either way, they accepted the call though. I'm not sure how the person on the other line introduced themselves, or if they even did at all, but they knew the full names of everyone in my family. Immediately, that was very creepy and alarming. The conversation soon escalated, as the person on the other end of this phone line specifically explained what our house looked like. They told my parents they were hiding in our backyard, which was large, dark, and full of all kinds of plants and trees, which made it very hard to clearly see. There were too many places to look. At this point, the tormentor made it clear they had intentions of entering our home and killing my sister and I. At this point, understandably, my parents were beginning to become frantic. Sure, there was a chance that nobody was out there and this was just some kind of cruel joke, but that notion was not worth the risk of believing. My dad asked if they really were where they said they were. If so, what were my parents doing at that moment? What were they wearing? Just like that, the person on the other end of the line explained exactly what my father was doing mid-action, exactly what they were both wearing, where certain items on our patio were placed, the expression on my mom's face as he said this, every detail. My dad, a rough guy with a heart of gold, charged into the night ready to kill any person he encountered. Neither of my parents had cell phones. I don't think they were even a thing at this time. My mom grabbed the phone which had been put down by my dad and called the cops. As brave and stupid as my dad was for venturing into the dark that night, he found nothing out there. When the cops arrived shortly thereafter, they found nothing either. The police were not able to trace the call because of the electronic interpreter, which they said was a fairly common device used by people trying to anonymously harass others over the phone. Nothing ever came of this incident, and as I said, I was not told about it until at least a decade after it happened. Was this the work of a former friend or enemy trying to play some kind of cruel joke? Was there an actual murderer in my backyard? I guess we'll never know.